I woke up with my head wedged between Sylph's thighs, and for 3 full seconds, I could not remember why I was alive at all. Then the wind found my face, sharp enough to sting, and the facts arrived in the wrong order. Pine trees, a cliff's edge, my own pulse going harder than a man waking from a nap had any business needing. I was alive. My hands worked when I told them to. My legs ached the specific ache of muscle that had been asked to do something it was never built for. Nothing was broken. That was the whole inventory, and it took less time to run than it should have. Sylph looked down at me, built like a boulder that had figured out how to breathe. All easy muscle with nowhere he needed to be in a hurry. "Have you missed my muscles?" he asked, flexing an arm that could have stopped a landslide. "I have not," I said, and pushed myself upright. He made a sound between a scoff and a wounded gasp. The sound of a man personally insulted by an honest answer, and turned 3 careful degrees toward the horizon so I would notice he was sulking. "Chesh, I came all this way because Anita told me to, and this is what I get." The name sat there a moment before it meant anything. Anita. Somewhere in the last clean stretch of my memory, before everything had gone dark, a voice had said something to me I hadn't caught all of. I understood now that Sylph had been the rest of that sentence. "How long was I out?" I asked. He didn't answer in words. He looked at the sky, then at me, in a way that told me it had been long enough that the question embarrassed him more than it embarrassed me. I let it go. Some answers cost more to get than they're worth, and I had learned to recognize which ones those were before I'd learned much else. Sylph had been bound to me since before either of us could say exactly when, a spirit tied to the shape of my own mana, which meant he found me wherever I ended up, conscious or not, without ever needing to be told where to look. It was the one part of my life that had never once needed explaining. I got to my feet slowly, testing my own balance like a man checking a bridge before trusting his full weight to it. Below the cliff, the land dropped away into a valley already going purple with early night. Somewhere past that valley, past 3 more days of walking, was the only home I had ever had. Something in my coat pocket was warm. It had been warm since before I woke, which meant it hadn't needed me conscious to keep doing whatever it was doing. I didn't reach for it yet. I looked at the horizon instead. The kingdom was out there somewhere, past the dark line where the hills gave up and the sky took over. I let myself want it for a moment. The practice yard, where I used to spar badly and laugh about it. My mother's rooms, the particular sound of my own name, said by someone who meant it kindly. I wanted to walk back into all of that so badly it sat in my chest like a stone. I did not move toward it. I watched the horizon for exactly as long as it took to finish that thought. And then I let it go, the way you let go of a held breath. On purpose, all at once, no longer needed. Whatever grief had been waiting to happen to me had already happened, somewhere in the days I couldn't fully account for. What was left now was arithmetic. They had spent 19 years deciding I was worth nothing. They had written it into the record, read it aloud in front of witnesses, filed it away as settled, and the entire time, the thing in my pocket had been sitting there, warm and patient, worth more than every verdict they had ever handed down about me combined. I smiled. Not at the kingdom. There was nothing out there worth smiling at. At the specific private distance between what they thought they'd thrown away and what I now knew I was carrying. "There it is," Sylph said, watching my face instead of the view. "There's what?" He tilted his head, just slightly. "That look. You get it right before you decide something." He wasn't wrong. I had already decided. I was not going home. Not yet, not through the front gate, and not as anyone they would recognize. I was going to find out exactly what I was holding, and then I was going to make every one of them wonder for the rest of their lives how they had missed it, to understand why a warm lump of nothing in my coat pocket was funnier to me than my own exile. You have to go back to the day the kingdom decided, formally and on the record, exactly what I was worth. I was the 13th son of a king who had once been the strongest mage in the realm, and a mother rare enough that other kingdoms had gone to war over women like her. Between the two of them, I should have been something remarkable. For most of my life, on paper, I was. My mana pool alone outsized any of my brothers, and my body moved faster than stats like mine had any right to move. Every appraiser who read my numbers said the same thing before they caught themselves. This one is going to be extraordinary. None of it came with an ignition switch. I could not cast so much as a candle flame spell. Every basic incantation a child half my age could manage produced exactly nothing when I tried it. My father had used contract magic to forbid me from training body enhancement without it. After the healers explained what happens to skin and muscle when a body is pushed past what unsupported flesh can survive. So I trained in secret anyway, on my own hours, and failed at that too. I tried the sword next, reasoning that speed alone might carry a body even without magic to back it. 3 years of of quiet practice taught me only that a blade needs strength and defense behind it, and I had neither in any useful amount. My mother summoned a great spirit once, hoping raw magical presence might do what training could not. It looked at me for a long moment, said nothing worth repeating, and left the way visiting nobility leaves a house it has already decided is beneath a second visit. The year I turned 19, my father spent a small fortune importing a cut of flame dragon meat from the neighboring kingdom of Kaimi on the theory that eating something powerful enough might jar a fire affinity loose in me. I ate it. I felt nothing. I had known I would feel nothing before I finished swallowing, the same way I had known it every other time someone tried a new theory on me. That was the year they called me back to the Hall of Truth to check. The Hall of Truth was where a standing mirror told a family the truth about what magic had given each of its children, in front of everyone important enough to be invited to watch. My brothers and sisters went ahead of me, one after another, and the mirror had something new to say about most of them. A fire affinity here, a small new skill there. Applause each time. The hall was standing room only, the way it always was for a public appraisal, and I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room already deciding what my turn would look like before it happened. A brother of mine turned to me on his way back to his seat and said, loud enough for the room, that he hoped the dragon stake had raised my worth by at least a little, since my face and my bloodline clearly hadn't been enough on their own. They made me go last. I don't know anymore whether that was cruelty or habit. It had stopped being possible to tell the difference. The mirror showed my numbers to the room the way it always did. The monototal nobody else in the family could match. The speed that should have made me a match for any knight twice my age. Then it reached the line where a skill name was supposed to appear, and instead of a name, it printed two words nobody in that hall could make sense of. Mystery egg. No description, no icon. Nothing the appraisers had ever been trained to read. The panel chief studied it for a long moment, murmured something to the two colleagues flanking him, and turned to my father to deliver the verdict that would follow me into every room I walked into for years afterward. No usable skill. Someone in the crowd laughed before they could stop themselves. My father did not laugh. My father did something worse. He looked at the mirror, then at me, and his face did not change at all. He dismissed the hall afterward, one prince and princess at a time, until it was only the two of us left in a room that suddenly felt far too large. Then, in the flat voice he used for orders, he told me to stay where I was. I stayed, and I had no idea, standing there, whether I was about to be forgiven or finally, formally, thrown away. Not long after that, my eldest brother decided to make the matter official. Baldwin stood before the full royal council and asked, formally, for my title to be stripped. He had the numbers ready. How many years I had trained without producing a single spell. How much the crown had spent on tutors and healers, and a flame dragon stake that changed nothing. How a prince who could not defend himself was a soft point in the kingdom's standing with its neighbors and its own nobility. He pointed to his own record while he made the case. 3 bound thunder spirits, contracts he had earned through his own magic, proof of what a prince was supposed to be able to do. I was, by his account, the opposite of that. A name on the family tree that cost money and returned nothing. A few of the older council members nodded along before they caught themselves and arranged their faces back into neutrality. Nobody in that chamber needed convincing of the facts. The only question on the table was what the crown was prepared to do about them in public, with everyone watching. The council listened. Nobody objected on my behalf, and nobody rushed to agree either. In the end, they did not vote at all. They deferred the matter for further consideration, which anyone who has sat through enough council sessions can tell you means yes, but not while the king is watching this closely. Not yet. I was in the gallery for all of it. I heard every word of the proposal and watched every face in that room decide, in real time, how much of my continued existence they were willing to defend. I said nothing. I did not stand. I did not ask for a chance to answer for myself. I had already done the math. There was no version of that room where a single word from me changed a vote that hadn't even happened yet. Baldwin wanted a title. My father wanted to avoid deciding anything in public, and I wanted, more than either of those things, to not give either of them the satisfaction of watching me beg for a life they had already started writing me out of. So I watched, and I filed it. The way I filed everything by then, carefully, without much feeling attached for later. It took me the better part of 2 years to get my hands on that piece of paper. I had a contact in the archive department, a clerk who owed me a favor from back when I was still worth doing favors for, before my worth had a number attached, and the number was 0. I paid him in patience more than coin, waiting while he searched old assessment files a little at a time. careful never to draw attention to what he was looking for. It finally surfaced buried under a decade of unrelated correspondence, filed under a heading that amounted to miscellaneous, not important enough to keep separate. I sat alone with a single candle and read it by that light, because I did not want anyone passing my door to see my face while I did. It was the appraisal panel's working notes from that day in the Hall of Truth, not the official report that had gone to my father, but the notes underneath it, in a hand small and cramped from writing fast. Most of it meant nothing to me. Figures, initials, shorthand I had to guess at. Then, in the margin, in a different ink, added later, as if the writer had gone back and reconsidered, 4 words and a recommendation. Output registered as mystery egg. Classification unknown, not null. Recommend secondary evaluation. I read it 4 times before I let myself believe what it said. Not null, not no usable skill. The 2 words the panel chief had handed my father as the official finding. The 2 words that had followed me into every room I had walked into since. Unknown, not nothing. A gap in their forms, not a gap in me. Somewhere on that page, a junior panelist had looked at my results and known enough to be uncertain and had recommended, in writing, that someone look closer. Nobody had. I found out later from the same clerk why. Filing that recommendation would have meant requesting a second evaluation, which meant flagging my father's attention, which meant explaining to a very particular kind of superior why the first evaluation hadn't been thorough enough to close on its own. It was easier, career-wise, to file the note under miscellaneous and let the official finding stand. One man's afternoon of professional convenience, and it had cost me 19 years of being introduced as the prince who could do nothing at all. I did not feel angry reading it. What I felt was closer to recognition, the quiet click of finally hearing proof for something I had already suspected and never had. They had been wrong, not cruel about it, not even careless in any way they would have recognized as a failure. Just wrong in the specific forgettable way an entire kingdom can be wrong about one person and never once have to answer for it. I folded the note along its old creases and put it back exactly where it had been, and I sat with the candle until it burned low, turning one thought over until it had a shape I could use. If they did not know what I actually was, then neither, technically, did I. That was worth finding out, and I intended to be the only one who did, for as long as it served me to be. That was the last clear memory I had before the dark closed over everything, and I woke up on this cliff with my head between Sylph's thighs and a kingdom's worth of history sitting quiet in my chest. Sylph had a small fire going by the time I turned back around, because apparently unconsciousness was no excuse for skipping dinner. He did not ask what I had been thinking about, staring at the horizon like that. He never asked the questions that mattered. He just made sure I was still there to eventually answer them myself. Sylph prodded the fire with a stick sized more like a small log. So, are we going home? No, I said. Not yet. Not through the front gate, and not as anyone they'd recognize. He nodded like that was the answer he'd been expecting all along, which, knowing him, it probably was. I had a title I had never really been allowed to use, a verdict on record calling me worthless, and the thing in my coat pocket that a dead man's paperwork had already proven the kingdom never understood in the first place. Somewhere past that valley was a life nobody back home would recognize, and I intended to build it before anyone thought to come looking. I looked at the fire, not the horizon, for the first time since I had woken up. Tomorrow, we would start walking, away from everything that used to call itself mine. Wherever this went next, it was mine to decide. That, more than anything else that had happened to me, felt like the truest thing I owned. Everyone else had already gone. The gallery had cleared, the mirror had been covered, and I was still standing exactly where my father told me to stay. Because when your father is also your king, you don't test which title just gave the order. An attendant came for me eventually and walked me down a servant's corridor I'd never used to a door I didn't recognize, in a wing of the palace where the carpets were older and the candles were real wax, instead of the cheaper spelled kind that lit the halls everyone actually used. My father was waiting alone inside, without his crown, without a single minister behind him to hear whatever came next. I did what any son does after failing in front of the entire court. I knelt. "I'm sorry," I said. "You spent a fortune on flame dragon meat, and I still couldn't pull a single skill out of that mirror." He asked, before anything else, whether I could manage even the simplest fire spell on my own. No mirror involved, no audience. I told him no. Not a spark, not a flicker, nothing. He nodded like a man confirming a number he'd already done the arithmetic on, and didn't ask again. Then he told me the meat had never been the point. He'd known before I took the first bite that it wouldn't change what the mirror had to say about me, and he'd ordered it anyway, because a father is allowed to to hope even after a king already knows better. He told me he'd pulled strings to have me appraised dead last that day, after every sibling I had, so that whatever the mirror printed would reach him first, quietly, before it became the court's favorite story by breakfast. He crossed the room next, pulled me up by both arms, and held me from behind the way he used to when I was still small enough to fit against him. His hands were enormous and warm, and they had never once, in 19 years, been raised in a council chamber to defend me. I broke, not gracefully. I cried the way a much younger version of me used to cry, hiccuping into his sleeve, apologizing for the tears in the same breath that produced them, and he let me, rocking slightly, saying nothing that needed saying. When there was nothing left in me, I straightened, wiped my face, and apologized again, this time for the crying, which somehow felt worse than failing the appraisal itself. He only rested a hand on my head, the way he had since I was small enough for that gesture to cover my whole skull, and told me to be at dinner. Then, he was already moving for the door, already becoming the king again before he'd finished crossing the room, calling ahead for whoever managed the court's instructors. I let myself out of a room that smelled like candle wax and old paper, and I didn't look back at it. He had meant every word. He had also never once said any of it anywhere a minister could hear him. I went to give my mother the same news the next morning, expecting a different reception. Where my father went quiet, my mother went off like a struck bell. She's bound to more wind spirits than anyone else in 3 kingdoms, and every one of them reads her moods like weather. I hadn't finished explaining that the mirror had printed the words mystery egg in front of the whole court before her spirits felt her happiness at having me in front of her, safe, and answered it before she'd said a word. The air around her chair thickened first, that faint pressure behind the ears right before a storm breaks. Then the eggs started. They came out of nothing, one after another, the way snow starts before you notice it's snowing. Small ones first, no bigger than a fist, rolling off invisible currents and knocking softly against the furniture with a sound like glass wind chimes. Then larger ones, a dozen at once, drifting past the garden doors, catching the light, bouncing feather soft off the bookshelves instead of shattering. Inside a minute, the whole room was full of them, floating at every height, some the size of a curled up cat, turning slowly like they were hunting for somewhere to land. I stepped around 2 of them without thinking, the way you step around furniture in a room you've lived in your whole life. A tree spirit my mother kept on staff drifted through with a tray of something dark and steaming, took one look at the state of the room, and simply changed direction toward the far table without comment. Used to this by now, she didn't so much as glance at any of it either. That was the part that undid me every time. This happened often enough between us that a room quietly filling with eggs barely registered to her as strange anymore. She grabbed both my hands instead. "You've gone thin," she said, tipping my chin up to check for herself. "And whatever that mirror decided to call you, I decided what you were a long time ago. A piece of enchanted glass doesn't get a vote." I laughed, the first real one since the Hall of Truth, while an egg the size of a melon drifted lazily past my ear and bumped the ceiling. She'd been mid-conversation with my sister when I walked in, some magically threaded call. Jill's voice thin and distant out of a carved stone disc on the side table, somewhere across the border doing whatever errand my mother had sent her on a week earlier. Without a trace of embarrassment, my mother was instructing her to come home with a proper bride candidate, someone with real magic of her own, someone who wouldn't flinch at marrying a mystery. "Don't bother," I told her, once the disc had gone quiet. "If she can't find someone with your spine or Jill's nerve, tell her not to send anyone at all." That earned a real laugh out of her, and the word impossible muttered fondly under it. Then she hugged me the way she always did once she'd decided a conversation was finished. Both arms, full weight, no warning between the decision and the impact. I caught the corner of a chair on the way down, and the room went dark before I finished telling her it hurt. None of that was the whole story, though. Not my father's private grief, not my mother's spirits raining eggs from the ceiling. There was something I already knew by then that neither of them did. Something I'd spent 3 months working out before I ever knelt in that meeting room. My engagement had ended before any of this happened. Fiona broke it off herself, in a letter, citing feelings she couldn't name and wouldn't discuss further. Everyone at court accepted that as a broken heart changing its mind. I accepted it too, for a while. It started small. She stopped reaching for my hand first, then flinched slightly when I reached for hers. A flinch she clearly hadn't given herself permission to have. By the time I noticed the pattern instead of the individual moments, she was already gone. I cross-referenced what I'd seen against an old medical text I borrowed from the archive under a false request slip. What I found wasn't heartbreak. It was a directed hatred spell, administered once, engineered to outlast the length of an engagement almost exactly. Someone had made her stop loving me on a schedule. I never told her. I wasn't certain I could prove it, and I was even less certain it would have mattered if I could. Vera had invited her alone months before, framed as nothing more than a future stepmother making a future daughter-in-law feel welcome. Fiona went gladly. She had no reason not to. Vera was precise, unfailingly warm in public, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's favorite blend without being told twice. The tea that day carried more than leaves. Vera had folded a hatred spell into the blend itself, keyed to whatever Fiona felt for me, cut fine enough to read as a slowly souring mood rather than a curse. A political move against the engagement would have been visible, contested, traceable back to a name. A cup of tea left nothing behind but a bad feeling that grew for exactly as long as it was built to grow. Fiona drank 2 cups, complimented the blend, and went home carrying, for the first time, a small flicker of something like distaste every time she thought of me. She didn't recognize it as unnatural. Nobody would have. By the 3rd week, the flicker was constant. By the 6th, she couldn't picture marrying me without a wave of something close to revulsion, with no memory attached to explain where the feeling had come from. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she told her own mother, the night before she wrote the letter, her hands shaking around a cup she couldn't finish. "I just know I can't." Her family accepted the broken engagement without much of a fight. A fiancé changing her mind wasn't scandal enough to contest, not when the Mirror had already handed the court a far better story about the groom. She never suspected the tea. Why would she? Vera had done nothing but pour it, smile, and ask about wedding colors. Vera never raised her voice about any of it, before or after. She hadn't hated Fiona. She'd simply decided Fiona was a loose thread and pulled it, the same clean, patient way she handled everything else in that palace. I didn't confront Vera. I didn't warn my father what his court had let happen to a girl who'd trusted us. I had no proof that would survive being said aloud in front of anyone who mattered, and every reason to believe that surfacing it now, days before I was due to leave for the border dungeon everyone expected me to fail at as thoroughly as I'd failed the appraisal, would only speed up whatever Baldwin was already building toward in the council chamber. So I packed instead. I folded the 2 truths I now carried: that my father loved me and had never once defended me, that my family's cruelty ran quiet and administrative rather than loud when it wasn't wearing his face, into the same drawer where I kept everything else I wasn't ready to use yet. My mother's love, at least, had never needed a public test to survive. That was worth something too, even if it wasn't enough on its own to build a life on. Baldwin still wanted my title. Vera still thought her tea had ended a problem cleanly, without a trace. Neither of them knew I'd already priced both of those facts into whatever came next. Whatever waited at the bottom of that dungeon, everyone expected to finish what the Mirror had started. I intended to come back out of it, knowing more than anyone who had sent me in. I had meant to come back from that dungeon, knowing more than anyone who sent me in. I did not expect the lesson to start 3 days before I ever reached it. The dragon's second pass missed me by less than its own wingspan. I remember that clearly, the wind of it, the smell of my own singed sleeve, and almost nothing after. Sylph got an arm under me before the 3rd pass could correct its aim and hauled me sideways into a ravine choked with black-leafed trees below the road. He put himself between me and the sky. I put my face against bark that smelled sour and medicinal, like something a physician would frown at, and thought that was probably the last thing I would ever smell. It was not. It was malsap, and I had bitten straight through a vein of it without meaning to. The same tree that likely saved my life did it by putting me to sleep for 2 weeks, long enough for a dragon to lose interest in prey it could no longer find, long enough for whatever the burn down my side needed to close on its own. The outriders my father had sent along had already turned back a full day before the dragon found me, convinced the road was clear. I did not know any of that yet, or that the burn would scar. I only knew the dark came up fast and total, and that somewhere inside it, before it took me all the way under, I heard people talking who had no business being there. I came back the way you come back from deep water. Light first, then weight, then the specific ache of a body that has been lying in one position far too long. Sylph's warmth against my side told me where I was before my eyes did. Someone else was breathing in the room. Not staff quiet breathing, someone sitting close and trying not to be heard and failing at it. The stranger in the chair was the first thing I saw when my eyes finally focused, built like he had been assembled for a different, larger world. He filled the chair the way water fills whatever holds it. He had clearly been there long before I woke, and he did not look like a man who had anywhere better to to be. His voice cracked on the first thing he said to me, that I was awake, that I was actually, finally awake, as if the fact needed saying twice before he would let himself believe it. Then he was out of the chair with both hands on my shoulders, gripping hard enough that it would have hurt if 2 weeks of lying still had not already numbed most of what I owned. Nobody stopped a summoned hero from going wherever he wanted in this house. I would learn that later. In the moment, all I understood was that a stranger with wet eyes and a crushing grip had been waiting at my bedside since before I had any memory of arriving there, and that Sylph, who did not warm to strangers, had allowed it. He told me his name was Seth and explained in a rush that kept doubling back on itself that he had come home with my sister, that Jill had said things about me he was not going to repeat because none of that mattered anymore, only that I was awake. He was also, it turned out, the one who had put an end to the dragon, arrived days too late to stop it from reaching me, in time to make sure it never got a second attempt. 2 weeks is a long time to sit in a chair, I said. My voice came out wrong, cracked and thin, but it worked. He said he had sat through worse, flat, like a fact rather than a boast, and let go of my shoulders as though he had only just noticed he was still holding them. Sylph shifted his weight against the mattress, a low sound in his chest that was not quite a growl, watching Seth's hands the whole time they had been on me. He's fine, I told Sylph, though I was not entirely sure yet whether I was reassuring him or myself. I asked what had actually happened to me, not the parts everyone already assumed I could not do anything about, the specifics. Seth admitted he did not have those. He had arrived after Sylph had already carried me in unconscious, and everything since had just been waiting. So I turned to the one witness who actually was there for it. Sylph gave me exactly 4 words. You talked. Nobody answered. Talked to who? Nobody I saw. It was the flattest answer he had ever given me. 4 words with nothing behind them to explain, and he did not shift the subject or add reassurance the way he usually would have. That, more than the answer itself, was the thing I filed away and did not mention again that morning. While Seth fussed with the water jug rather than sit still, I tried, quietly, to see whether 2 weeks of doing nothing had changed anything. It had not. I reached for the thinnest thread of the mana that pooled uselessly inside me, the way I always did, half hoping the coma had shaken something loose. An egg rolled out from under the blanket instead, exactly as unhelpful as always, and lay there being an egg. Seth watched it roll off the mattress with the open, delighted interest of a man who had clearly never seen this happen before in his life, and asked, twice, whether it was going to hatch. Seth pulled the chair right up against the bed frame, close enough that I could see he had not slept properly, in longer than 2 weeks either, and went quiet in a way that felt worse than his crying had. He asked me to let him say something before I decided what to do with it, and I told him to go ahead. I did not have anywhere else to be. What came out of him, in pieces, was this. Where he came from, he had a younger brother, Utah, an ordinary death, nothing heroic, nothing anyone could have fought. The kind of accident that ends a life without asking anyone's permission first. Utah had died before Seth was ever pulled into this world. Seth was careful, almost formal, about saying that I was not him. He was not confused about that part. He knew exactly who I was. He was less careful about the rest of it, that it did not matter I was not Utah, because I was the same kind of person Utah had been, and he had already decided, sometime during those 2 silent weeks, what that made me to him, before I had ever woken up to have an opinion about it. He said the actual words plainly, like a man reading out a verdict he had already signed and was not taking back. I was his brother now, his dead brother, come back different. He knew exactly how that sounded and said it anyway. It sounded like grief wearing a hopeful face. It sounded, if I was honest with myself, like exactly the kind of thing I would have wanted someone to say to me if I had ever let myself want it out loud. I did not tell him the strange part was not his declaration. The strange part was that I had already been thinking something close to the same thing about him over the length of one conversation. This enormous, overwhelming stranger who had apparently sat at my sickbed for 2 weeks rather than be anywhere else in a kingdom that had handed him every reason to feel important. Nobody attached to me like that without wanting something back. He did not seem to want anything except to have said it out loud and have it land somewhere. That was the part I should have been more careful with. A bond only one of us had built could be dismissed later as one grieving man's invention. A bond we had both built, without comparing notes, was not something I would be able to explain away afterward. It also was not something I was going to be able to put back down. Seth talked more once the hardest part was out of him, the way people do when the biggest confession clears a path for the smaller ones. He had been pulled into this world mid-sentence, no warning, no choice, out of an ordinary life and straight into a summoning circle ringed by people who already had plans for what he would be worth to them. A council had assigned him a party inside his first week, and every single member of it, by his own account, had wanted something specific out of him before they had bothered learning his favorite food. One had wanted him sparring every dawn before he had learned the local calendar. Another had wanted his blessing recorded for a temple's fundraising drive before he had learned anyone's name. I was the first person, he said, who had just talked to him, not to the hero, to him, and asked what he missed from home instead of what he could kill. I did not remember the conversation he meant. I had probably thought it was not worth remembering at the time. A bored, half-invisible prince making small talk with the famous foreign guest because the alternative was making conversation with my own family. It had cost me nothing to be decent to him. It had apparently cost him something to notice that it cost me nothing. Sylph made a small sound that might have been agreement. There was a version of this conversation where I pointed out that being chosen for decency does not protect a person from what people with none of it decide to do with you. I did not know yet exactly how that debt would come due. I only had the shape of the warning, not the date. Kings do not reward the men who love their inconvenient sons. They use them, and then they use the men who loved them too. I did not say any of that to Seth. It would not have meant anything to him yet, and I was not finished finding out whether it meant anything to me. Your identification skill, I said instead. Use it on me. He looked surprised I had asked, then obliged, studying me with an expression that had nothing to do with his eyes. The skill making the eggs had a name, he told me. Incubation. That was all it was called. Whatever had been quietly ruining every spell I had ever tried to cast. There was supposed to be a second skill waiting behind it, he said. One that usually locked into place around level 10. An egg hatching skill. Years of being told I had nothing, and the truth had a name, and the name sounded like a punchline. I let the joke of it sit for a moment before I said the only part that actually mattered to me. I need to know what it actually does before someone else decides for me what it means. Seth did not have an answer for that and did not pretend to. He just nodded, like it was a reasonable thing to want, which was more respect than the request had gotten from anyone else who had ever heard it. By the end of that week, I could stand without the room tilting, and Seth had made himself close to permanent. He turned up wherever I was without being summoned, offered to spar even though sparring with him would have ended the argument in one exchange, and made it clear, without needing to say so twice, that he intended to keep doing this indefinitely. I let him. Not because I had stopped being careful, I had not. And after what Vera's tea taught me about what family cruelty looked like wearing good manners, I doubted I would ever fully stop again. I let him because the alternative was pretending I did not want what he was offering. And that week, I was tired of pretending about everything. He had already informed the household staff that he intended to sleep within call at night, whether or not anyone had a spare room ready for him. He noticed, without me saying anything, that I meant to go back to the dungeon once I could hold a blade without dropping it, and told me flatly that he was coming with me. I did not argue. Some other week, I might have. That week, I had just spent several days learning that being chosen by someone with nothing to gain from it was rarer than any skill I might unlock at level 10, and I was not in a hurry to talk him out of it. I still did not know who I had been talking to in my sleep. I still did not know what incubation was actually for, but I knew, walking back toward that dungeon a second time with a self-declared brother at my shoulder, that I was carrying more than I had the first time I set out, more warmth, and underneath it, already, the first thin edge of a debt whose size I could not yet see. We made it a few days down that same road before Seth stopped walking. Not because of another dragon, because of a draft he said he didn't like, coming from a stand of trees off the path. When we went to look, we found a hole at the root of an oak wide enough to drive a cart through, breathing cold air out into the afternoon heat. A dungeon core had bloomed inside it sometime in the last month, small enough that nobody had reported it yet. Seth crouched at the mouth of it, called it new and safe, and said it was a better place to start than whatever was waiting for us at the border. I did not want to detour. I said so. Seth pointed out, reasonably, that I had never cast a single spell in my life, and would not learn what my own skill did by standing at a hole in the ground arguing with him about it. Level 10 was the number every child in the kingdom learned before they learned their letters. The point where a second skill locked into place, active instead of passive, whatever that turned out to mean for someone like me. I had never reached it. Nobody in my family had ever let me try, not with anything that mattered riding on the answer. Here, in a dungeon that belonged to no one yet, there was nobody to stop me, and nobody to disappoint if it came to nothing. That settled it faster than I wanted to admit. I had already asked back at the estate whether the threshold was truly fixed at level 10 or whether it moved depending on the skill itself. The household tutor who still bothered answering my questions had confirmed it without hesitating. 10 was 10, for princes and beggars and hedge mages alike. The one rule in the entire system that didn't care who you were born to. I had filed that answer away the same way I filed everything useful, and now I meant to spend it. Sylph came without being asked, the way he always did, folding his shoulders down small to fit through the hole behind us. I went first. Seth didn't try to stop me, though I felt him at my back the whole drop into the dark. The same instinct that had kept him at my bedside for 2 weeks, not quite believing there wasn't more he should be doing. The drop was longer than it looked from outside, a rough slide down packed roots into a dark that smelled of wet bark and old rain. My boots found flat ground before my eyes found any light at all. Then the glowstones took over, dim green studs threaded through the walls like something had scattered them there on purpose, and the dungeon opened out in front of us, narrow and quiet, and smaller than I expected for something old enough to already have monsters living in it. The floor was easy walking at first, packed earth and old roots, and the first things we met were a few fat mushrooms that Seth froze solid before they could puff a cloud of sleep spore at either of us. I finished them off with a spear he'd handed me before we went in, since I still owned nothing sharper. A goblin chasing something smaller through a side passage went down the same way not long after, iced mid-stride, left for me to land the last blow. The way Seth always found some reason to let me be the one who finished a fight, instead of only watching him do it. Near the second stairwell, we found what looked like the only way down and wasn't. A set of steps too clean, too convenient, sitting slightly wrong in a room that hadn't given us a single easy thing yet. Seth caught it before I set a foot on it, said something about how a newborn dungeon liked to test whoever found it first, and led us around the false stairs to a second one, hidden behind a fold in the wall that looked, until you touched it, exactly like solid bark. A slime slid out from under the false steps, once Seth had shown us the truth of them, colorless and unbothered by the fact that its prey had already escaped it twice. Sylph ended that one without breaking his stride, a short gust that popped it against the wall before it managed to ooze more than a foot toward my leg. He didn't so much as glance back to see if I'd thanked him. He never did. Somewhere around the third kill, I felt the pull that meant a level had turned over. The same lurch in my chest every level gave me. Mana pouring into a reserve that had no business being as large as it already was. 10,000 units, gone in an instant, added to a pool the court back home had once called an aberration, and left at that. Nobody had ever explained why a prince with no spells needed a mana pool that size. I had stopped expecting them to. We went down through 2 more short flights after that, clearing what stood in front of us and nothing more. Seth had no patience for a slow crawl, and neither did I. Somewhere past the second landing, my count went from 8 to 9, I told him. He grinned like I'd handed him something worth keeping. Level 10 came on the landing after that fight, not during it. I felt it clearer than any level before, a lock clicking somewhere under my ribs that hadn't been there for level 9. Seth felt it too, the way he always seemed to know before I said a word, and turned his appraisal on me before I could ask him to. He read for a long moment, long enough that I already knew, before he said anything, that it wasn't going to be good news. 2 skills, he told me, the incubation I already carried, and a second one sitting new and untested beside it, numbered like they belonged together, though the reading gave no name for what the second one actually did, only what it wasn't. Not combat, not craft. No guaranteed output, no guaranteed value, a novelty. He read the wording the way a person reads something aloud that they wish they hadn't been the one to pick up. He laughed once, short and involuntary, the kind of sound that gets out before the person making it decides how they feel about it, and then looked like he wished he could take it back. I didn't need him to apologize for it. It was the same verdict, dressed in different ink, that I'd been carrying folded in a pocket since I was old enough to read council minutes. Unknown, not null, the first appraiser had written, years and a whole kingdom away from this landing. Novelty item, no guaranteed value, said the second one, in a dungeon that didn't even have a name yet. Different rooms, same shrug. Seth tried to explain, haltingly, that the ward keeping the reading wasn't really judging anything. It was only sorting, the same blunt sorting that happened at every dungeon this size, before a report went to the crown, matching whatever it saw against categories some clerk had written down 100 years ago and never once updated. He was trying to make it smaller than it felt. I let him. It didn't change the words on the parchment, and it didn't change that this was the second official reading of my life, and the second time an entire system built to measure people had looked at what I could do and shrugged. I took the reading from him and put it away next to the other one nobody would ever ask to see again. Seth watched me do it, jaw tight, like he wanted an argument to have with someone and couldn't find one standing close enough to hit. Sylph made a low sound at nothing in particular, the same not quite growl he saved for anything he'd decided was a threat to me without bothering to explain why. I folded the parchment away and looked at him. A judgment isn't proof of anything. It just means somebody was in a hurry. He didn't answer that so much as fall into step beside me, and we went on to the next stair down. 3 floors down, the corridor opened into a room Seth had turned into a gallery without meaning to. He'd gone in first, and by the time I caught up, he had 4 things frozen mid-motion around the chamber. Something with too many legs, a squat shape with its claws still bared, a mushroom the size of a dog with its spore sac split open and stopped in the act of bursting. He liked freezing things whole, he'd told me once, so that I never had to look at whatever came out of them if he'd hit them any other way. I was working my way toward the mushroom when its spore sac tore free of the ice. One last convulsion before the thing finally died, flinging a spray of something pale and glittering across the room straight at me. I had time to move. Every instinct built into me from 2 weeks recovering from a burn I could still feel on cold mornings said to get out of the way. I stood still instead. If the reading on the landing meant what I thought it might, if incubation converted magic instead of only failing to cast it, I needed to find that out on my own terms, in a dungeon room with nothing at stake but a stray plant, rather than for the first time somewhere a mistake could cost me more than a scare. The spray hit my arm. It did not burn. Something under my skin went warm, then cool, then still, like water deciding to become ice and changing its mind halfway through. I looked down. An egg sat in my palm that had not been there a breath earlier. Warm the way the ordinary eggs my passive skill dropped were always warm, except this time I hadn't reached for mana and failed at a spell the way I always did. I hadn't done anything at all except stand where every instinct told me to move. A second egg formed almost the same instant, smaller, from a different direction. Seth's own ice, shearing off the wall behind the dying mushroom in a spray of frost he hadn't aimed at me and hadn't meant to send my way. It caught my sleeve, and where it touched, a second egg grew heavy in my other hand, cold instead of warm. 2 spells, 2 eggs. Neither one mine to begin with, not really. Mixed, the reading on the landing had said, my mana and someone else's, folded together into whatever this skill actually was. I hatched the first one the way I'd tested the mechanism 100 times on the ordinary eggs. My other skill dropped whenever a spell failed. It cracked open in my palm and gave up a sprig of pale green leaf, still damp, smelling faintly of the tonic the estate healer kept locked away for anyone badly hurt. A lesser healing herb. I turned it over twice to be sure the dungeon's light wasn't playing a trick on me. It wasn't. It was a real plant, grown out of nothing but a spell that should have scorched me. I pressed a thumb into it. Soft, faintly springy. Exactly the texture of the tonic leaves I'd watched the healer crush more times than I could count over the 2 weeks I'd spent unconscious in that sickbed. Whatever had made it hadn't copied the idea of a healing herb. It had made the actual thing. The second egg hatched into a small disc of dull orange metal, heavier than it looked, still cold from the frost that had made it. Copper. A whole ingot of it, small enough to close my fist around, worth more sitting in my palm than anything the court had ever said about me was worth in a room full of ministers. So that was what it did. Not a rumor passed between servants. Not a margin note in somebody's ledger. A spell hit me, and instead of hurting, it became something else. An egg first. And then, when I asked it to, whatever the egg had in it to become, 2 low-rank spells, barely worth the mana it took to cast them, had just handed me a healing herb and a lump of copper. I did not know yet what a spell worth actually casting would leave behind. I intended to find out. Seth had stopped freezing anything else by then, watching me with the look he got when something confirmed a thing he'd already suspected. He said, in his usual way of turning a feeling into a fact before he'd checked it was one, that he had told me the skill was worth something. He just hadn't known it would take a lucky graze in a dungeon room to prove it. I put both items in my satchel, next to the appraiser's folded verdict, and looked around at what was left standing in the room. 3 more shapes stood frozen around us, waiting their turn, and Sylph had already drifted toward the nearest one, sniffing at it the way he did anything he didn't trust to stay dead. None of them threw anything else at me before Seth put them down properly. I almost wished one had. We kept going. 4 floors wasn't much of a dungeon, and Seth wanted me to clear the rest of it before we went anywhere near the actual border. His reasoning, when I asked, was simple enough. A newborn dungeon with nothing worse than mushrooms and one confused goblin in it was a cheap place to learn what I could survive. The real one waiting past the frontier was not. I couldn't argue with that arithmetic. Once we finished here, he meant to report the place to the crown himself and have it sealed, the way any dungeon this size was supposed to be handled once it had served its purpose. 1 floor was left below us by his count, smaller again than the one before. The kind of shrinking pattern he said most newborn dungeons followed before the core either matured into something permanent or burned itself out entirely. Whichever this one did wasn't my concern. I only needed the last of its monsters to hand me whatever they had left to give. Sylph stayed close through the last of it, quiet the way he always was when there was nothing that needed saying, though I caught him eyeing the mushroom room once more on the way past, unconvinced the thing was as dead as it looked. I still had the appraiser's fold of parchment in one pocket, and 2 small proofs of what it had gotten wrong in the other. A healing herb, a lump of copper, neither one impressive on its own. Together, they were the first evidence in my entire life that the thing everyone had already decided about me might not be the whole answer. I did not know the ceiling on it yet. I did not know what a real spell, a war mage's fire, a priest's light, whatever waited on the far side of that border, would leave in my hands instead of a scar. I meant to find out. That was reason enough to keep walking. Seth asked if I wanted to try something bigger before we pushed down to the last floor. I said yes before he had finished the question. We had spent most of the day on the smaller end of it, once the herb and the copper ingot proved the mechanism was real. A weak ice shard here, a stray gust there, anything he could throw at low cost without wasting the trip. Every egg I hatched afterward gave up something small and mostly forgettable. A length of dyed thread, a chipped whetstone, a jar of pickled roots Seth ate half of before admitting it was decent, a pair of boots that fit nobody in the party. No pattern held between one item and the next. Bigger spell, better item seemed to be the only rule that survived the whole afternoon, and even that one bent more than it broke. A middling gust once produced a small magic stone, worth more than a proper fireball had the try before it. I stopped trying to predict the output and started only tracking the input, which item came from which spell, what it cost Seth to cast it, what came back. Somewhere in the 3rd hour of that, I noticed I had stopped thinking of the pile in my satchel as curiosities and started thinking of it as stock. I did not say that out loud. It felt like the kind of thought that changed something if I let it sit too long in the open air. I wanted the part that actually mattered, not whether the skill worked, whether it scaled. Seth didn't like the idea at first. Committing to a real spell against me, instead of a training toss, was a different kind of risk even with the appraiser's reading in my pocket telling us both it would convert. I told him that was exactly the point. If it hurt, we would know the ceiling today, on a floor we already controlled, instead of finding it later somewhere that didn't care how many questions I still had. He gave in. He always did, eventually. I stood still and told him not to hold back. He asked twice more if I meant it. I only answered the second time. The ice lance came in low and fast, the kind of spell built to punch through most things an adventurer wore as armor, and I had exactly long enough to register how much bigger it looked than anything he had sent my way before it hit. It did not punch through anything. The cold went into me and turned, the way it always did, into something else. Heavier this time, dense in a way the mushroom spray and the frost backwash from days ago had never been. I felt the egg form before I saw it, sitting across both hands, because one wasn't enough to hold it anymore. A weight settling into my palms like a stone dropped from a height. I hatched it standing right there. Whatever came out of an egg that size, I wanted to see it the moment it existed. A compass, small, brass-cased, warm on its own without a fire anywhere near it. The needle inside spinning once before settling on a direction that had nothing to do with north. Seth read the make off it in the same flat professional voice he used on anything he appraised. A category worth its own shelf among navigational artifacts, rare enough that any trader who knew his trade would recognize the tier on sight, built to survive weather that would kill an ordinary compass in an hour without ever needing a flame near it. I turned it over twice. It was worth more than the herb and the ingot combined, by a distance that made the comparison almost embarrassing. 2 spells, both of them mine to receive on purpose now instead of by accident, and the second one had outclassed the first by a margin that had nothing to do with luck. Seth had said, back at the very start of this, that the skill would need proper teaching before it meant anything. He had been right about that the way he was right about most things, patiently, and without making me feel small for needing to be shown. Seth guessed a price for it anyway, the way he guessed at most things before there was any way to confirm them, more than he would have earned in a month running contracts for the local guild, for the one item alone. Never mind what the herb or the ingot might have fetched, if either of us had bothered to ask a trader instead of keeping them in a pocket. I did not argue with the number. I wrote it down instead, the first figure in what I already suspected would need to become a much longer list, and told myself the list was the actual point of tonight, not the compass. One floor was left below us. We went down to find it. The last staircase ran on longer than the first three combined, and it led out into something that did not belong in a dungeon this young. A temple built from what looked like a single tree's worth of wood. Walls carved floor to ceiling with the same dryad-shaped figure, repeated so many times that counting them felt like a joke before I had even started. One path led in. It ended in a hall with a living tree growing straight up through the center of the floor, its canopy brushing the ceiling 3 stories overhead, roots pushing up through the boards in slow ridges. Every wall around it lined with more of the carved figures, silent and still, in a way nothing carved from wood should have been able to hold. We circled the hall once, quietly, the way we had learned to circle any new room before deciding it was safe to breathe in. The carved figures watched us do it with the same unmoving faces the whole way around, hands folded or raised, or reaching, depending on which one I looked at. None of them alike enough to be decoration, and none of them different enough to be anything but decoration, which was its own kind of unsettling. Seth found a pair of old chests along the wall, both untouched, and we split what little they gave up between us without much ceremony. Nothing that changed the shape of the night, just weight added to a satchel that was already getting heavier than it had any business being. Seth said the tree itself was safe. He had checked it twice before I finished looking up at the canopy. The statues were the part he had not checked yet, and when he finally turned his reading on them, he went quiet for longer than he had for anything else all day. 400, he said, like the number embarrassed him to say out loud. 8 rank, every single one, dressed up as decoration in a dungeon, too new to have any business housing something that size. The only reason we were both still breathing, he told me, was that none of them had moved yet, and the only reason they hadn't moved yet was the single exit running past a line none of them had been given a reason to care about. I asked him what happened if someone crossed it. He did not answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. When he did, it came slower than usual, like he was weighing whether telling me was a mistake before he had finished the sentence. 400 A-rank statues waking at once was not a fight, he said. It was a weather event. Something a hero could stand inside of and nobody else could, and even he would rather not test how long that held. I had spent the whole day proving my skill scaled with whatever hit it. I had not proven it scaled with everything at once. I told him I wanted to cross the line. Seth said no, in roughly 9 different ways, none of them containing the word itself. I let him get through most of them before I asked whether he actually believed 400 bolts would do anything different to me than one already had. He did not have an answer for that either. Sylph, for his part, had not moved from beside me since the reading started, which I had learned over the last several days was its own kind of vote. He did not argue for caution the way Seth did, and he did not argue against it either. He only stayed close, which in his language meant he had already decided how this was going to end. In the end, Seth agreed to the only version of the plan that did not leave me standing there alone. He would hold his ground at my shoulder, close enough to act if something went wrong that had nothing to do with magic. I told him that was fine, on the condition that whatever he saw happen in the next minute, he let it happen without stepping in unless I said otherwise. He did not like that condition. He agreed to it anyway. I crossed the line. Nothing happened for 3 full breaths. Then every statue in that hall turned at once, carved necks swiveling with a sound like 100 doors opening in the same second, and the air filled with more raised arms than I could count before the first one fired. Seth's hand went for his sword, not the plain one at his hip. The other, the one he never drew unless he meant to pay for it. Wait, I said. Sylph's hand closed over Seth's wrist before the blade cleared its sheath. He said one word, low enough that I nearly missed it under the noise building around us. Don't. Seth stopped. I stepped out in front of both of them, into the open, where every one of those 400 carved faces had a clear line to my chest. The first attacks moved slow enough to see coming. Stone bolts cracking loose from carved fists, green light gathering into needles the length of my forearm, splintered wood shaped and thrown like arrows, a low droning hum that built somewhere in the back wall and broke loose as a sound I felt in my teeth before I heard it. Slow enough, and there were still 400 of them, and the hall itself seemed to lean in to watch what 400 of anything looked like moving at once. The first one hit. It became an egg before it finished landing. The second hit before the first had cooled. Another egg. Then all of it arrived together. 400 small violences landing in the same half second. And I stopped being able to count the individual moments where a spell turned into something else. I only knew the eggs kept coming, faster than I could track, faster than anything had ever come at me before, piling into the space around me instead of the ground. A stone bolt struck my shoulder and turned to shell in the same breath it would have taken to bruise me. A wooden arrow crossed half the hall and dissolved into warmth an arm's length from my face. The droning hum hit last and hardest, and where it should have knocked the wind out of me, it only left a heavier egg than the rest, rocking gently against my collarbone like it had somewhere better to be. They did not stop at my hands this time. They filled the air, egg after egg, warm and cool, and warm again, depending on what had made them, crowding closer together until there was no gap left between one and the next, a floating mass thickening around my whole body like a swarm that had decided, together, to become solid. The room narrowed down to the size of the field they made. Shells pressed against my arms, my back, the side of my face, weightless and warm and endless. A wall built out of 400 failed attacks, with me standing at the center of it like the one still point in weather. I could see Seth's shape through it, blurred gold and green behind a wall of shells, his mouth moving, no sound reaching me through what the air between us had become. None of it touched me as force. It came out of mana instead, a straight draw against a reserve I had stopped trying to picture the size of 45 million units, a number I usually repeated to myself the way you repeat a joke that stopped being funny years ago. It was not a joke anymore. It was the only reason 400 attacks landing in the same half minute felt like arithmetic instead of dying, a ledger balancing somewhere under my ribs, faster than I could have followed with my own eyes. The hatching took the better part of a minute, long enough that Seth told me afterward he had counted his own heartbeat just to keep from reaching for the sword again, and long enough that the sound alone, shell striking shell, over and over, 100 small collisions folding into one continuous roar, was the loudest thing either of us had stood inside since the day started. Then the field dropped, not faded, dropped all at once, the way a held breath finally lets go when there is nothing left to hold it back. Eggshells hit the floor in a wave of sound, like rain arriving all together, scattering out from where I stood in a ring wide enough to reach the base of the tree, and where 400 statues had stood a moment earlier. 400 husks stood instead, drained, cracked open at odd points, not one of them able to lift an arm. I was still standing, unmarked, whole. 400 husks ringed the base of the tree, slumped at whatever angle they had been standing in when the last of their magic left them, and the hall that had felt like a held breath a minute ago now felt like the after image of one. Dust still drifting down from the beams where the sound had shaken something loose. Seth did not move for a long moment. Neither did Sylph, though Sylph's stillness had never meant the same thing as fear. Seth's eyes went from the husks to the eggshells scattered in a ring around my boots, to me, and back to the husks again, like he was trying to decide which part of what he had just watched to believe first. Seth said my name once, quietly, the way a person checks that a word still means what it meant a minute ago. I told him I was fine. I meant it. There was not a mark on me anywhere, which was somehow harder to explain than if there had been. Hatching 400 eggs took longer than making them had. We cleared a space near the tree roots, and I went through the pile in order, cracking one shell at a time, Sylph nosing at each new item as it landed like he expected one of them to still be dangerous. None of them were. Most of it was ordinary, in the way anything from this skill had started to feel ordinary to me by now. Cloth, tools, raw metal, a small mountain of the same low-grade materials any dungeon this size might have handed over eventually, just compressed into one sitting instead of spread across a dozen fights. I sorted it into the satchel without stopping to admire any single piece, working through the pile the way I imagined a clerk worked through a ledger at the end of a long quarter, fast and mostly unimpressed. Then I hatched an egg that did not behave like the others, thick and slow to crack, and a gauntlet came out of it instead of a tool. Not leather, not steel. Something older than either, plated in a metal gone the color of a held coal. The fingers so finely articulated that they moved when I flexed my own hand inside it, though I had not meant to test that on purpose. Seth's reading took longer on that one than it had on anything else all week. He told me, eventually, that his skill could not place it in any category it recognized. Not a crafted rank, not a dungeon drop tier. Whatever mana had gone into making it had come from somewhere older than the system currently pricing dungeons at all. A leftover from before the current order of things was as close as he came to explaining it, and I got the sense he was choosing the safest version of a much stranger answer rather than the honest one. 2 more items came out of the last few eggs. Neither one Seth could name any better than the gauntlet. A plain silver ring with a single word etched inside the band, a name, Anita, that meant nothing to either of us, and something else that hummed faintly against my palm for a moment before going still. And I packed both away with it rather than press him for a guess he clearly did not have. Whatever they turned out to be, they could wait. Tonight only had room for one answer at a time, and the gauntlet had already claimed it. I did the only math I actually trusted. Whatever the gauntlet was, it was worth more than everything else in the satchel combined, including the compass, and probably worth more than everything the satchel had ever held across every floor before tonight. A whole day of small, careful tests had handed me a herb, an ingot, and a compass. One deliberate risk, taken in a room I had chosen to stand in, had handed me this instead. Seth did not say he had told me so. He did not need to. His face did that on its own, and for once, I let it stand without a comeback. We surfaced 2 days later, once the dungeon had nothing left standing between us and the way out, the last of its floors as quiet leaving as the first had been arriving. I sold the compass at the first town with a trader, who did not ask where it came from, for more than Seth had earned running contracts the whole month before this trip. I sold it because I needed the number confirmed, not because I needed the coin. A guess from Seth was one thing. A price a stranger was willing to pay, no questions asked, was the only version of the number I could actually build a plan around. The trader who finally looked over the gauntlet went quiet first, turned it in her hands twice, held it up to the light before she'd let herself say anything at all, and then named a figure that made Seth repeat it back to be sure he had heard her right. I did not haggle. I did not need to. I only asked her to write the number down before she changed her mind about saying it out loud. Whatever the wording on that dungeon reading had settled on for my second skill, cosmetic adjacent, no guaranteed value. It had never seen what that skill looked like, fed 400 A-rank attacks in the same half minute. I did not say that out loud to anyone. I wrote it down instead, in the same place I kept the reading itself, folded next to a compass worth a month's wage, and a gauntlet worth more than either of us had bothered to guess before someone finally named the number. I had my answer, or as much of one as 400 statues could give. This skill did not have a ceiling I could see yet. It only had the size of whatever question I was willing to stand in front of. The border dungeon had 2 mouths instead of 1, and half the region's crews already knew about it by the time Sylph set us down at the tree line. 2 cores opening in a single dungeon was rare enough that people rode for days just to see it happen. 4 other companies had beaten us there, tents already going up along the ridge, and one of them had staked the nearer entrance before we had even finished unpacking. Locals called it the border dungeon for the obvious reason. It sat close enough to the edge of the kingdom's own maps that a bad week down there and a diplomatic incident were about the same distance apart. It had also sat closed and unremarkable for years before this. Whatever had cracked it open into a second core, nobody camped on that ridge could tell us, and none of them looked especially interested in finding out before someone else did. We had sold the gauntlet only 6 days earlier, and the money from it still felt like it belonged to someone else's plan. This dungeon was different. It was the one we had actually set out for, weeks ago now, before Seth turned us toward the smaller forest dungeon instead, and called it a safer proving ground. He did not call anything safe anymore. The rival company wore matching gray cloaks under a banner none of us recognized, and they moved like people used to winning arguments about which entrance belonged to whom. One of their scouts called across the distance to ask whether we meant to contest the near entrance. Seth answered for both of us, and I only caught the shape of it rather than the words. Something short, easy. The kind of answer that ends a conversation instead of starting one. The scout laughed, said something about us wasting our time on the worse hole, and went back to his own tents without waiting for a reply. Seth watched them stake their claim a moment longer, said their formation looked sloppy for people that confident, and led us toward the second entrance instead, the one with the worst reputation, according to the scouts who had mapped the outside. Nobody else wanted it yet. That suited him fine. Going down, I noticed him rest 2 fingers against the hilt of his second sword, not drawing it, just checking it was where he had left it. He had done that exactly once before, in the forest dungeon, right before Sylph closed a hand over his wrist and stopped him from finishing the motion. I filed it and kept walking. The second core sat buried in the chamber's far wall, a slab of dark stone about the size of a heart, pulsing a slow blue-black light like something breathing in its sleep. Seth thought the 2 cores were paired, that draining one hard enough would provoke the other, though he admitted he did not know the mechanism behind it. That was the whole of his theory. He tried a slow draw first anyway, a thin line of ice pulled straight off the core's surface, testing whether we could bleed it gently instead of forcing anything. The chamber answered with a single shudder that ran up through the floor and into my boots. Then the east wall came apart. A stone golem tore through the rubble without warning, man-shaped, twice my height, built from the same dark mineral as the core itself, its joints grinding stone against stone with every stride, and somehow still faster than anything that heavy had any right to be. We pieced together afterward, from what the rival scout let slip that night, that their crew had pushed their own extraction too hard and too fast, trying to finish before we reached ours, and whatever their core had thrown back at them, they could not hold on to it. It found its way to us instead. Seth's ice took chunks out of its shoulder, and it kept coming. Sylph hit it twice with a blast that would have folded a lesser wall in on itself, and it barely staggered before closing the distance again. I stayed back the way I always did in a straight fight. Nothing here needed converting. No spell aimed anywhere near me. Just weight and stone moving fast enough to kill a person the ordinary way. When it finally caught Seth with the flat of one arm and put him down hard enough that the impact echoed off the galleries above us, I understood, a half second too late to be useful, that we had misjudged what this floor was going to cost. He got back up, and I watched him reach for the second sword properly this time. No one stopped his hand. The hilt was wrong the moment I actually looked at it. Older, plainer, wrapped in something gone dark with age rather than use. Nothing like the practical, well-kept grip on the sword he wore every other day of his life. I had come across weapons built like it once, in the Kingdom's library, in the section they do not let just anyone browse. Contracts written on a life instead of on mana. The world summoning class. The kind that measured its own power against however many years a wielder had left, rather than however much magic they could spend in a day. I had never expected to actually watch one drawn in front of me. I recognized exactly what I was looking at before he had even finished whatever words called it back into his hand. It split into 2 the instant it cleared the sheath, thin lengths of metal winding around his forearms like they had done it 1,000 times before. For the length of one swing, the world seemed to catch and hold the way a held breath holds. Then it let go. One swing. The golem came apart into rubble and dust mid-stride, still trying to finish a step it would never take. Seth straightened slowly, one hand still closed around the hilt, and for a moment his was not the face I had been looking at all week. Something around his eyes had gone sharper, harder, older, the specific hardness that belongs to someone who has lived through more mornings than he had a week ago. Gray had come into his hair at both temples, threads of it that had not been there when we walked down. His breathing took longer to settle than the fight itself had lasted. Sylph's ears had gone flat the moment the second sword cleared its sheath, and they stayed that way through the whole exchange, watching Seth with the same wary stillness he usually saved for actual threats. He did not say anything about it. I did not ask. I did not thank him for the save either, and he did not appear to want it. I only noted that the ledger between us was open now, whether either of us ever put a number to it, and filed that thought next to the others I was not ready to say out loud. We did not get long to recover. The chamber did not get the chance to go quiet on its own either. The core split down its center with a crack I felt in my teeth, and let go of everything it had at once. Not a beam, not a bolt, but hundreds of them, spraying in every direction like something too pressurized to keep its shape any longer. Light came off it in every direction at once, a white glare that turned the whole chamber the color of the inside of an eye. And for a moment, I could not tell which way the bolts were even traveling before they were already gone, already converted, already nothing. None of it touched anyone. My field caught every bolt the instant it crossed close enough to reach me, the way it always did. Except this time, there was no line to step over and no decision to make. It simply happened the way flinching happens. Eggs filled the chamber faster than the 400 statues ever had. Seth had to shout to be heard over nothing at all, since none of it made a sound crossing the air between us. When the swarm finally thinned enough to see through, the core was a dead gray lump in the wall, and the floor around me sat ankle deep in shells. Seth said a dying core's discharge was mana for mana, like taking a few hundred of the crown's strongest battle mages and setting off every one of their best spells in the same instant. He did not offer that comparison lightly. Most of what hatched was the kind of bulk material that pays for a caravan and not a headline, or by the sackful, raw dust, a scatter of low-grade potions that would sell fine and mean nothing to remember. A short blade with an edge that would not hold survived the pile too, along with a bracelet whose only notable feature was that Seth's reading found nothing notable about it at all. One item stopped him cold, a key small enough to close a fist around, cut from a metal with a faint grain that caught the last of the dying core's light in threads, its teeth shaped into a pattern that matched nothing in the ordinary architecture of a lock. His appraisal, which had gone quiet once before over an old god's gauntlet, went quiet again over this. He turned it over twice in his own hand before giving it back to me. It was not built for any door on the current maps, he told me, and he said it the way he said very few things, like he meant it exactly, without any room left over for a guess. I pocketed it without much ceremony. Whatever it opened, it was not going to open itself tonight, and I had learned by now that some questions were worth carrying rather than answering on the spot. The chamber around us looked like the inside of a cracked geode by then, shell fragments catching what little light the dead core still gave off, everything else gone dark and still. Seth sat down hard against the chamber wall the moment the adrenaline let him, the way a man sits when he has just spent something he cannot see the bottom of. Sylph crouched beside him, unbothered, the way he always was. I told them I wanted to check the back of the chamber before we called the floor cleared. There was a gap in the wall where the core had been, and cold air was moving through it that should not have had anywhere to come from. Seth waved me off without looking up. Sylph came with me instead. The gap led to a threshold, not a room. The passage simply stopped, the way a sentence stops mid-word, and past it, the air went cold in a way no draft explains. No echo came back when I said Seth's name once, quietly, just to see whether my own voice still worked the same as it had a minute earlier. It did. That was somehow the more unsettling detail, that everything about me still functioned normally in a place that plainly did not follow the rest of the dungeon's rules. Sylph went still beside me. That was the only warning I got. She was already there when I looked up, not descending, not arriving in any flash of light, simply there, the way a shadow is already there once you notice it. A woman, unremarkable in every way a goddess had no business being unremarkable. Plain dark clothing, no crown, no light coming off her, pale in the particular way of something that had never once needed blood to look alive. She might have been any age. She might have been every age, if I let myself look long enough to test it, though something in me refused to look that long. Her eyes were the only part of her that did not feel unremarkable, not their color, which I could not have named a minute later, but how completely still they held on me, the way a scale holds still once whatever it is weighing has finally settled. I did not run. I want to be honest that the thought crossed my mind and left again almost as fast. The way a name you already know does not need repeating. Her voice was quiet, and it did not repeat itself. "You are marked for an early death," she said. "I intend to collect what is owed when it comes." "Whose mark?" She let the cold sit between us before she answered. "Mine. I am owed this one already. I am only telling you so that you know it in advance." Her hand closed around my wrist, cold the way stone is cold, not the way death is supposed to be cold. "This is not a gift, it is a claim." Warmth moved across my skin and was gone inside a breath, and where her fingers had been, a thin pale line remained, circling my wrist like something drawn by a hand too steady to shake. Sylph did not growl. He did not step between us the way he had for nearly everything else since the day I met him. He only watched, ears back, tail still, the particular stillness he reserved for things he had already decided he could not fight. Then she was not there. No flash, no door, no sound. The cold air kept moving through the gap exactly as it had before, as if nothing had used it to pass through at all. I understood later, without her needing to say it, that a dungeon this close to collapse was probably the nearest thing to a doorway a goddess like her ever got to use, and that doorways like that one do not stay open long. That was likely the whole of why now, rather than whenever my death actually arrived. Standing there, I turned the fact over, the way I turned over anything that mattered before deciding what to do with it. It was not the first time in my life that a stranger with more authority than warmth had looked at me and decided what I was worth without asking my opinion on the matter. A room full of witnesses had done the same thing once, years earlier, and I had survived that verdict by refusing to let it decide anything for me that I had not already decided for myself. Running crossed my mind again here, and I let it go again for the same reason as the first time. If she had already decided when to collect, putting distance between us would not change the arithmetic. It would only spend years. I still had left arguing terms I could not see. Seth was back on his feet by the time I returned, color back in his face, moving like the fatigue was already filed away somewhere he did not plan to revisit. He asked if I had found anything back there worth the detour. I told him it was a dead end, cold air, and nothing else, and he took my word for it, the way he took most of my words for it. I did not correct the sleeve I had already pulled down over my wrist. We camped that night among the trees outside the dungeon's mouth, the three of us and a fire that did not need to be large to do its job. The light caught the new gray at his temples every time he shifted, small threads of it that were not going to disappear by morning, the way ordinary tiredness does. Seth fell asleep faster than I had ever seen him fall asleep, which told me more about the sword's price than anything he had said about it out loud, which was nothing. I checked my wrist once the fire had burned down to something that would not throw enough light to see much by. The line was still there, thin and pale, easy to miss unless someone already knew to look for it. I decided I would not look for it on purpose more than I had to. Somewhere in the last 2 days, a debt had opened between the three of us that none of us had priced yet. Years of Seth's spent keeping me alive, a mark on my own wrist whose cost I did not know yet, and a skill of mine that kept outgrowing every guess anyone made about it. None of us had named a number yet. That did not mean the account wasn't open. I stayed up longer than I needed to, turning 2 other facts over next to each other, the way I had once turned over an appraisal reading that called my skill cosmetic adjacent. The first, there did not appear to be a ceiling on what my skill could take in, and I had spent 2 dungeons now, proving it wider than anyone had guessed. The second, whatever I was building toward with it, a goddess had already looked at the length of my life and found it short enough to write down. Both facts pointed the same direction. Neither one pointed home. That night, without telling Seth and without telling Sylph, I decided I would go back to the capital one more time before I did anything else, to see my mother once more while she would still recognize the version of me she remembered, and to get one last close look at how the kingdom's politics actually stood before I decided how much of any of it I still owed. After that, I intended to leave it behind for good. None of that got announced out loud. I only started, from that night on, showing up at the palace a little less than the week before, and a little less than the week before that, until leaving would not look like a decision to anyone watching. It would only look like something that had already been happening for a while. The fire burned down to coals somewhere around midnight. I did not stay awake to feed it. Sylph set me down on the ridge road a half-mile short of the capital's north gate, same spot he always used when I wanted to walk the last stretch in alone. It had become a habit these past months, one of several nobody but the 2 of us had noticed. I'd been keeping my visits shorter and further apart since the night at the border dungeon, trimming myself out of the palace's daily rhythm the way you'd wean an animal off a hand it trusted too much. Nobody would have called it a decision if you'd asked them. That was the point. The faint line around my wrist itched, the way it sometimes did for no reason I'd found yet. I hadn't spoken about it since it happened, not even to Sylph, who'd seen the whole thing and had never once brought it up either. This visit was going to be different, though I hadn't told him that part. I meant it to be close to the last one. Seth was somewhere back in the palace already, resuming whatever routine he kept when he wasn't dragging me through dungeons. I didn't go looking for him. Whatever this visit was going to cost, I wanted it to be mine and my mother's, not something the 3 of us processed together the way we processed everything else. Sylph didn't ask where I was going. He rarely did. He just settled into the tree line to wait, the way he always did when I told him a place he couldn't follow into without causing a stir. And I walked the rest of the way to the residence that had once been the whole of my world, already counting the visit in hours instead of the usual careless whole afternoons. My mother, Eleanor, crossed the last few feet at a dead run and hit me hard enough to actually stagger me, same as she had since I was small enough for that to make any kind of sense. "You're too thin," she said, holding me back by the shoulders to look me over, like a vendor checking fruit. "Have they stopped feeding you at that dungeon? Or are you just too proud to eat properly with Seth watching?" "I eat fine." "Liar." She swatted my arm without any real force behind it and pulled me the rest of the way into the garden. "Sit. Tell me everything, and don't leave out the parts you think I don't want to hear." Her garden was the one place in that whole palace that never felt like it belonged to a kingdom. Wind moved through it even on still days, curling around the blossoming trees and stirring the grass in patterns that had nothing to do with weather, because it wasn't weather, it was her, and everything she'd bound herself to over a lifetime of collecting spirits nobody else could hold on to. I told her about the dungeon in broad strokes, the 2 cores, the size of the yield, nothing about the sword, and nothing about the mark, because some things I still hadn't decided how to carry, let alone hand to someone else. She listened the way she always did, entirely present, asking small, sharp questions that proved she'd actually heard me instead of waiting for her turn to talk. She asked, not for the first time, whether I'd reconsidered marrying any of the women the court kept parading in front of me. I told her, same as always, that I hadn't found anyone worth the paperwork. She called me impossible and clearly meant it as a compliment. Her joy did what it always did around me. I felt the pressure build behind my ribs before I even saw the first egg, that specific magic trying to leave the air and become something else instead. And then it dropped into the grass by her feet, warm, faintly humming, already still. She didn't glance down at it. She never did anymore. It had stopped being strange to her years ago, which was its own kind of miracle considering what it actually was. One of her spirits drifted into the garden partway through it all, a gust of interested wind that circled the growing pile of eggs twice before settling near her feet like a dog deciding whether it was allowed to eat something. She swatted at the air without even looking over, more habit than complaint, and the wind subsided into an offended little eddy that spent the rest of the afternoon sulking around the far hedge. There's another one. I didn't bother pointing. She could feel it as well as I could. She stretched out on the bench like she owned the whole afternoon, which she basically did. Let them have their fun, she said. It's been too long since the whole household got worked up about something good. I let it run longer than I should have. I always did with her. An hour of ordinary things. Jill up and walking again. A spirit's complaint about being bored. Plans to redecorate a hallway nobody else cared about, while eggs kept surfacing around us, one every few minutes, until a dozen or more sat scattered across the grass, warm little shapes catching the light like something had hatched a whole flock of them out of nothing. I knew exactly what I was risking every time I let a visit run that long. I did it anyway. This one, I'd already decided, was allowed to cost more than it should have. The wind that finally ended, it wasn't even a strong one. It caught 4 or 5 eggs off the ground at once, carried them past the open window at the garden's far wall, and into the corridor beyond, before either of us thought to move. My mother laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd seen all week. I didn't laugh. I knew exactly what a handful of eggs drifting loose into a palace corridor was going to turn into. Anomalous magic near the queen's wing did not go unremarked there. It got reported, the same way anything unusual in that wing always did, through channels built to move faster than either of us could chase it down. I should go. She didn't argue, which told me she'd noticed my face change even without knowing why. She just pulled me into one more hug, gentler than the first, and held on a beat longer than the greeting had. Come back before winter. Her voice came muffled against my shoulder. Promise me that much. I'll try. Halfway down the corridor, away from her wing, I could still feel a thread of that same wind curling faintly around my ankles, trailing me like it wasn't quite ready to let me leave the grounds yet. It gave up somewhere near the outer stairs and didn't follow any further. It wasn't a lie. I meant to come back. I just didn't know yet that the next time anyone in that palace saw me, I'd be a name carved into a stone marker instead of a son standing in the grass with eggshells scattered around his boots. None of what follows I actually saw. I built it afterward the way you rebuild a broken plate from pieces other people hand you separately. From Seth's face in the days after, from the exact hour a summons went out that night, from small procedural details, a place like that always leaks, even when it tries hard not to. My father, Roland, called Seth to a private room. No ministers, no witnesses, nobody whose presence there would need explaining later. What he told him, stripped down to its actual bones, was that the 13th prince's continued existence had become a political instability the crown could no longer manage. It needed managing in a way that would actually hold this time. He wanted it done quietly. He wanted it done by a hand the court would never think twice about. Not a hired blade. That leaves a trail and a price someone could trace. A hero acting under a king's direct word, though. The law and the histories both treated as an entirely different animal from murder. Seth did not refuse him. Whatever argument passed between them, if any did, didn't survive long enough to change the outcome. Because by morning, Seth had the look of a man who'd already made peace with something he hated doing. I know he didn't sleep that night, The guard rotation record I saw afterward had his lamp burning until past dawn, and Seth never burned good oil for nothing. The detail that took longest to reach me, and the one I trust least and believe most, is that my father's hands were not steady when he gave the order. That he said it once, plainly, the way you'd say something you needed to get out before you lost your nerve, and then sat alone in that room afterward and wept where no minister would ever see it happen. I don't know for certain who was close enough to that room to know it and pass it to me. I have a guess. I'm not going to name her, because if I'm wrong about how she knows the things she knows, I'll have cost her more than the information was ever worth. I have turned that fact about my father over more times than I can count, and I have never once landed cleanly on whether it makes him better or worse. A man who orders his own son's death is not supposed to also weep about it in private. A man who weeps about it in private is not supposed to also give that order. He did both, in the same night, in the same room. By the time I reached the gates again, I wasn't wearing anything that marked me as anyone. Plain traveler's clothes, hood up against a wind that wasn't really blowing, and Sylph close enough behind me that whatever the wards used to sniff out a royal signature came back reading nothing worth flagging. The board went up on the first morning, nailed to the public notice post where every merchant and off-duty guard in the capital would see it before noon. It was short. It gave my full name and my place in the line, 13th of my father's children. It did not say how I had died, only that it had happened, that it had been sudden, and that the kingdom mourned appropriately. I stood in the crowd and read it twice, the same as everyone else, as if reading it again might change a word of it. A woman beside me with a basket of bread on her hip said something quiet to the man next to her about what a shame it was. A young prince gone like that, and moved on without slowing down. I told myself I was staying to see the whole shape of what came next, not just the announcement itself, because whatever I decided to do afterward needed to be built on the real size of the thing, and not my guess at it. Nobody around me recognized the man standing 3 feet from the announcement of his own death. That was the design working exactly as intended. I watched strangers grieve a version of me they'd never actually met, and found I could do it without feeling much of anything specific. Sadness, maybe, but a flat, distant kind, like hearing about a funeral in a town I used to live in a long time ago. The procession came on the second day. A sealed casket, never opened for viewing. The notice had called that royal custom for a death this sudden, and nobody in the crowd questioned it. Carried from the palace gates to the mausoleum grounds by 6 guards in formal black. My father walked behind it, appropriately grave, for a crowd that needed to see grief performed correctly. I don't know what was actually inside that casket. I have never wanted to know badly enough to ask. Whatever it was, however they'd managed it, it held up well enough that nobody around me so much as whispered a doubt. By the third day, the crowd outside the gate had thinned considerably. Grief, it turned out, moved fast when there was nothing new to look at. A few mourners still came to lay flowers against the notice post, mostly kitchen staff and off-duty guards, who'd apparently liked me well enough in passing, which was its own strange thing to learn about myself while standing 3 feet away and unrecognized. The ceremony itself happened inside, out of public view. I wasn't there for it, obviously, and I never tried to reconstruct that part the way I reconstructed my father's private room. Some rooms I decided I didn't need the details of. The dining hall resumed its normal serving schedule on the 4th morning. I know this because I made a point of finding out. 3 days of official mourning, black banners, hushed voices, a market that closed early out of respect, and then breakfast at the usual hour, like nothing had interrupted anything at all. I stood outside those gates for all 3 of those days and watched the whole thing happen in order, start to finish, exactly the way the notice board had promised it would. The first thing I saw of her, indirectly, through whatever gap Sylph found for me between the wind outside and the stone of that room, was that she wasn't crying. Everyone else in the procession had been, at least a little. She stood in the antechamber alone for exactly as long as it took to be sure no one else was watching, dry-eyed, spine straight in her mourning dress, and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the sealed edge of the tomb door. I recognized the gesture. She'd used it on me once before, years earlier, in a room full of people who couldn't know she was telling me anything at all. It meant, more or less, I see you. Say nothing back. I had no way to answer her, and she wasn't asking me to. She turned and walked out the same measured way she'd come in. And if anyone in that corridor thought her composure was strange for a woman who'd just lost her brother, nobody said so, where it would reach me. That was enough. Whatever she knew, however she'd come to know it, she was carrying it exactly the way I needed her to, silently, without cracking. I didn't need to see anything more than that to know she was still safe. My mother came alone, later, once the lantern had burned down low enough that the room was more shadow than light. She found the diary where someone, I still don't know who, and some part of me doesn't want to, had placed it among the effects sealed into the antechamber shelf. A plain leather book, unremarkable, the kind you'd overlook completely if you didn't already know exactly what it was. She opened it standing up, without sitting down first. I remember that detail specifically because it meant she hadn't expected to need to. For a long time after that, she did not move at all. Not a page turned, not her weight shifted, nothing but her eyes going back and forth in the lantern light. A draft found its way through the antechamber door at some point during all that stillness, guttering the lantern low enough that her shadow doubled and split against the far wall. She still didn't move. I don't know exactly which pages held her there so long. I'd written a great many ordinary things in that book over those last 2 weeks. The eggs, Jill up, and walking again. A magic book I'd been saving to give her before I ever thought I'd need an excuse to. One entry near the end mentioned a doll on my shelf that had laughed once, out of nowhere, and how I decided to take it as a good sign instead of asking anyone what it meant. None of it was important. All of it, apparently, was. When she finally moved, it wasn't to close the book. It was to press it flat against her chest with both arms, the way you'd hold something you were afraid could still be taken from you twice. She stayed like that long enough that I made myself stop watching before I saw whatever came after the stillness broke. I looked away first. I want that on record, for whatever it's worth. I was the one who couldn't keep watching, not her. She did not leave the book behind when she finally left the antechamber. Whatever she told anyone who asked where it had gone, I don't think anyone actually asked. Sylph was waiting where I'd left him, and he didn't ask what I'd seen. He never did. He just fell into step beside me, matching my pace exactly the way he always had, and let the capital get smaller behind us without a word about it. The kingdom believed I was dead, officially, completely, with a sealed tomb and a public notice, and 3 days of appropriately somber meals to prove it. My mother had the one true thing that survived me, and she wasn't giving it up. My sister was carrying a secret that could cost her everything and hadn't so much as blinked. My father had given the order with shaking hands and then wept where no one could ever use it against him. None of that changed what I meant to do next. I didn't know yet exactly where the road in front of me went. I knew only that it went away from the capital, and that for the first time since Sylph had set me down outside those gates, I wasn't planning on turning back. The road went east for 2 days before it told me anything about where it led, and on the second afternoon, it led into a clearing I hadn't chosen, and Seth clearly had. He was already there when Sylph set me down, sitting on a fallen log like a man who'd had time to get comfortable with waiting, and he wasn't alone. My mother stood a few steps off in plain travel clothes instead of anything from her own chambers, and beside her was a young woman I'd never properly met. Arya, Seth said, one of the spirits bound to me since before I was old enough to remember binding anyone, given a shape and a name, for a day she'd apparently decided was worth wearing both. She inclined her head, short and precise, like a soldier reporting for an assignment she'd rehearsed in her sleep. I've protected worse odds than this. Seth explained the rest standing up, the way he explained anything he didn't enjoy saying. Fast, plain, watching my face more than his own words. The wound had to be real enough to survive my half-brother Colin's scrutiny. His gift for reading history left no room for a fake that only looked convincing from a distance. Real, severe, and paired with a method only he and my father knew, built to bring me back from the edge of it rather than past it. He'd chosen this clearing for the privacy. He'd chosen today because today was what he had. He didn't give me the whole shape of the method, only enough of it to know it existed and that it depended on speed more than anything else. Get the cut right, get the recovery started before too much time passed, and the rest would hold on its own. I asked him what too much time meant in practice. He said it wouldn't come to that in the voice of a man who had already decided that believing it was the only usable option left to him. He'd told my mother and Arya enough in advance to explain what they were about to see without frightening them out of letting it happen. A controlled cut, a fast recovery, nothing they hadn't already trusted him with once before. He hadn't told them what it would look like if it failed. He hadn't planned for that version either. "You'll eat something," my mother said, already unwrapping something from a cloth bundle. before any of this happens, as if a good meal could hold off whatever was coming by sheer force of will. She kept finding small tasks for her hands after that, smoothing a blanket that didn't need smoothing, checking a water skin she'd already checked twice. The particular busyness of someone who needed her body occupied so the rest of her wouldn't have room to panic. I let her fuss over me the way I had as a child, without complaint, because it cost me nothing and gave her somewhere to put an hour she couldn't otherwise have survived. I asked Seth why she needed to be here for it at all. He said she didn't need to see the method to know it would work, only enough to say goodbye properly first, and that she'd insisted. The same immovable way she insisted on everything that involved me. I believed the plan. I'd watched this man work since the day he pulled a dragon off my chest without stopping to explain how. His competence had never once needed reproving, not to me. I told him I was ready before he'd finished asking. Sylph didn't stay for the rest of it. Seth asked him to range ahead along the road we still meant to take once this was finished, watching for anything that might complicate the next stage of the plan. Nobody thought to watch the road behind us. Nobody thought they needed to. The kingdom already believed I was dead, and dead men don't get followed. Sylph looked at me a moment longer than the errand required, then went. Baldwin walked into the clearing like he owned the road under it, and for a breath, nobody moved. He'd had my route watched since the announcement went up, he told Seth. Not warmly, not as a confession, just a fact laid on the ground between them to see who flinched first. He didn't trust a notice board and a sealed casket to actually mean what they claimed, and a secret this dangerous wasn't one he intended to risk on anyone else's word. He'd come to see the job finished with his own eyes, and to make certain that if anything went wrong, he could say he'd been nowhere near it. "You have no business here," my mother said, stepping half in front of me without seeming to notice she'd done it. Seth didn't argue with him at all, and I watched him not argue, which told me more than an argument would have. The careful stillness of a man doing arithmetic he already knew he'd lose. Baldwin hadn't come to help. He'd come to watch, and he made that clear without ever raising his voice, settling onto a boulder at the clearing's edge, like a man who intended to stay until he had what he wanted. He looked at me directly then, for longer than the moment required, the way a man checks a ledger entry he's about to close out for good. I held it without giving him anything to read off my face. Whatever satisfaction he was looking for, I decided somewhere in that stretch of silence that he wasn't going to get it from me, only from whatever he was about to watch happen. Arya's weight shifted onto the balls of her feet, the smallest readiness, gone as fast as it came. Seth asked for a minute. Baldwin gave him considerably less than that, glancing at the darkening sky like the hour itself was an inconvenience someone ought to apologize for. There was no version of this where Seth sent him away and tried again tomorrow. Baldwin would report the delay as suspicious all on its own, and suspicion was the one thing the whole plan couldn't survive. I watched Seth reach that conclusion in about the time it took Baldwin to cross his arms, and I reached the same one a half second behind him. He drew the second sword. I'd seen him draw it exactly once before, months earlier, against a stone golem that hadn't survived the swing. It had aged him 10 years in that single motion, gray threading into both temples, a hardness around his eyes that never faded back out. He knew the cost going in every time. He was choosing it again, for me, with an audience he hadn't planned for sitting on a boulder 6 feet away. His hands were steady. I noticed that specifically, because it was the one thing he could still control about the next few seconds, and he was controlling it on purpose. Under normal conditions, he would have taken longer over this, a slower breath, a wider stance, whatever ritual of preparation the method actually needed that he'd never described to me in full. Baldwin's presence had cut all of that down to almost nothing. Seth was doing in a few rushed seconds what he'd built to take considerably more care over, and both of us understood exactly what that difference meant for the margins. We looked at each other before he moved, just that. No words worth spending on it. His face wasn't the face of a man about to kill someone. It was the face of a man about to do something he'd convinced himself was survivable, doing it now under conditions that had stopped being survivable the moment Baldwin walked into the clearing, and knowing it and continuing anyway, because there was nothing left on the table that cost less. I understood exactly what I was agreeing to. I'd watched this man carry me 2 weeks unconscious after a dragon nearly finished me for free. I'd watched him spend years of his own life on a golem, so I wouldn't have to spend anything at all. Trusting him with a rushed version of a plan he'd built to save me wasn't naive. It was the only math that still worked, and I had run it myself before I ever told him yes. I didn't step back. I didn't close my eyes. I waited, the way you wait for weather you already know is coming, and let him do it. The blade found what it was aimed at. The world tipped sideways and then very far away, cold moving in fast where there should have been pain. And the last clear thing I heard before the clearing turned to noise was my mother's voice breaking on my name. Baldwin didn't stay to watch what came after. One look at me on the ground was all the confirmation he'd ridden 2 days for, and he was already turning back toward the tree line before her scream had finished leaving her throat, gone before anyone might have thought to stop him and ask what he'd actually seen. What happened next reached me in pieces, the way things reach you when your own body has stopped being a reliable witness. Arya hit Seth before he'd even lowered the sword, a full, committed strike that would have dropped anyone without his training, and he took it without lifting a hand to block it. She hit him again, and a third time, each strike landing somewhere different, testing him for an opening he never bothered to close. He let every one of them land, absorbing blow after blow with his arms loose at his sides. And I understood, even from where I was, that he wasn't defending himself so much as trying to hold still long enough to feel what was going wrong. Something was going wrong. He knew it before anyone else did. I could see that much in the set of his shoulders, even through the haze closing in around my own eyes. The method that was supposed to catch me before I went too far wasn't catching anything at all, and every second he spent standing still and taking Arya's fists was a second he was spending trying to find out why. My mother arrived at a dead run, and the clearing changed shape around her. Her spirit stopped bothering with human form the moment she called them, shedding it the way a coat drops off a shoulder, until wind and water and raw cold light were tearing through the trees on their own terms, uprooting saplings that had stood there longer than I'd been alive. "Regenerate him," she said, before she'd even reached them, and they didn't wait for a formal casting to obey. Warmth poured into me and drained away again just as fast, spent on nothing. She threw herself back into the ranks a second time, both hands raised. Again, all of it, again. Nothing changed. Then, closer, quieter, the words breaking apart before she finished them. "Whatever's holding him back, burn through it." When that failed too, she reached further than I had ever seen her reach. She called something down that answered to almost nobody, a beast I'd never laid eyes on before, antlered and enormous, crowned in a white fire that didn't burn anything it touched, its presence alone pressing the air flat around us like a held breath. The whole clearing was taking at once. It knelt where she pointed and poured everything it was into me, joining its strength to hers and to every spirit she still had left standing. None of it took hold. Whatever was interfering with the recovery sat above all of it, untouched, unbothered, the way weather doesn't notice a single person shouting at the sky. The ground around us had gone to broken earth and splintered trunks, entire trees leaning at angles they were never meant to hold. The whole clearing rearranged by power, with nowhere left to spend itself except on the world around us. And still nothing reached the one place it needed to. I felt each failed wave arrive and pass through me like weather crossing a window. Warmth and then nothing. Warmth and then nothing. Each one a little weaker than the last, not because her power was fading, but because mine was. I had one clear moment left in the middle of that, and I used it on her. I said something. I don't fully know what, even now, only that it was short, and it was for her. And then I pushed. Not hard. I didn't have hard left in me, just enough to put her a step back from where I was, so that whatever was about to finish happening wouldn't have her standing close enough to be the last thing it touched. The chaos didn't stop because I pushed her. It simply stopped mattering, all at once, the way noise stops mattering the moment you go underwater. She was already there when the water closed over me, the way she'd already been there once before, at the bottom of a different, smaller, dark. The clearing went quiet around her without anyone telling it to. The fighting behind me, I understood it was still going on, distantly, simply stopped registering, the way a room stops registering once you've fallen asleep in it. She hadn't arrived so much as become the thing the rest of the world was arranged around, the way a single held note reorganizes a whole piece of music once it starts. No light came with her, no sound announced her. She was simply, suddenly, the only fixed point left in a clearing that had spent the last several minutes coming apart. She looked exactly as unremarkable as she had the first time, plain, still, pale in the way of something that had never once needed blood to look alive, and that was somehow worse than any spectacle would have been. Nothing about her had to announce what she was. It was simply true, the way gravity is true, whether or not the room agrees to notice it. She didn't raise her voice to be heard over any of it. "You remember what I told you?" I did remember. Marked for an early death. A claim, not a gift. I'd carried that thin, pale line on my wrist since a dungeon corridor, and I'd carried something else too, without ever knowing why. A plain ring, pulled out of the same hall, with a name scratched inside the band that had meant nothing to me until this exact moment. The name arrived before I'd decided to say it out loud. "Anita, you have carried it," she said. "Longer than you knew to look for it." A pause, unhurried, the cold settling deeper into the ground around us. This was never going to cost nothing. What it costs comes later, and it will not be small. She told me the arrangement had never belonged to whatever technique Seth believed he controlled. It was always going to resolve on her terms, the only terms a claim like hers had ever recognized. Every plan built around a wound, however carefully staged, was still built on top of a debt that predated it, and no amount of preparation on Seth's part had ever been able to change whose signature was actually on that debt. She said all of it without cruelty, in the same flat, exact register she'd used the first time, like a fact being reported rather than a sentence handed down. Seth's voice broke through then, closer than I expected, rawer than I had ever heard it. "Stop it, stop!" She looked at him the way you look at weather that has already decided what it's doing. Gods did not renegotiate. I already knew that, in the vague way you know a rule you've never had to actually test. Her hand found where her hand had found me once before. This time, there was no letting go afterward. I didn't feel it as an ending. I felt it as a kind of quiet I hadn't been offered in a very long time, settling all the way through, until whatever had been holding my shape together simply stopped bothering to hold. And the last thing I carried anywhere was the sound of my own name, spoken once, gently, by someone who had never once raised her voice in my presence. I wasn't there for what came after. I only learned of it much later, in pieces, from people who had no reason left to spare me any of it. Seth didn't move for a long time. He stood in the wreckage of the clearing with the sword still in his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would have changed anything he had just watched happen. The gray at his temples looked no different than it had an hour earlier. Whatever this had cost him, it hadn't shown up the way the golem's cost had. It had simply taken the one thing he'd spent years trying to protect instead. Arya found her voice before anyone else did. She had bought him time, believing there was still a version of this where the time mattered, and now that it hadn't been enough, the grief had nowhere left to go but at him. "You told her it would work," she said, quieter than shouting, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. She didn't understand yet. None of them did, not that first night, that he had never wanted anything else. My mother didn't say anything at all. She had spent every spirit she had and called down a beast that answered to almost no one, and none of it had been enough to matter. She sat down in the middle of the ruined clearing, the way a person sits when standing has stopped serving any purpose, her hands still open in her lap, as if something might yet fall into them, and stayed there long after the other two had run out of words. Someone else watched all of it happen, and nobody in that clearing ever knew he was there. Colin had been following my road for longer than anyone realized, chasing his own private question rather than any errand from his mother. He was young, half a vampire, and mortal in a way the older bloodlines in our family weren't, which meant he had spent most of his life afraid of exactly the kind of ending he was now watching happen to someone else. Whether a person could come back from that ending at all, and how, was the only reason he had bothered to follow me this far. He watched from the tree line with his gift already open, reading everything the ground and the air had recorded of what had just happened. He confirmed it the way his skill always confirmed things, completely, with no room left for doubt, and he said nothing to anyone, standing close enough that a single step forward might have changed something. He didn't take that step. Whatever he was looking for in a dying prince's last few minutes, standing still and saying nothing was apparently closer to it than helping would have been. He waited until the clearing had gone fully silent, and then he left the way he had arrived, without disturbing a single leaf. Somewhere back in the capital, a third woman had been watching too, by methods I never did learn the details of. Alara hadn't ordered any of what happened on that road. It hadn't been her plan, her sword, or her risk, but she understood immediately what it meant. Seth was now the only living person outside the palace who knew the order had come from my father's own mouth, and knew that the death the court had already announced hadn't actually happened the way the court believed. A man who knew both of those things and stayed loyal to no one but a dead prince was a loose thread in a story the crown needed kept perfectly sealed. Loose threads could be pulled, or they could be cut. She began that same night, working out which one served her better. Colin went to his mother before he went anywhere else, because that was the report she expected of him, and he had never yet found a reason to refuse her one. He told her what his gift had shown him, and she believed him instantly. She had already half guessed it from my mother's face days earlier, when the first fragments of the road reached the palace. She asked him, once, whether he was certain. He said Historia didn't leave room for uncertainty, and that was the end of that particular question between them. What she didn't know, because Colin didn't tell her, was that the body the official story had already buried didn't match what he had actually seen out there. That gap between the tomb everyone had accepted and the truth only he now carried was either a problem she would need to bury a second time or the sharpest piece of leverage she had held in years. She began turning it over immediately, the way she turned over every piece of information that came to her, for what it was worth, not for what it meant. She hadn't decided which use suited her yet. She intended to find out before anyone else in the palace even knew there was a decision to make. Two queens, in two rooms neither of them shared with the other, started calculating that same night, over the same gap, each one certain she had gotten there first. That was the shape of the night I died, pieced together afterward from people who owed me nothing and told me anyway. I was not there for any of it by the end. I only know that somewhere in that clearing, across the space of about an hour, a plan built to save me finished killing me instead. And the story the kingdom had already told about my death turned very quietly, almost true. I was aware before I was anything else, not awake. Awake implies a body, and I didn't have one of those anymore. Just aware, the way you notice a room before you notice you're standing in it. The place smelled like the inside of a cold library, if a library could smell like anything at all. Somewhere past that, a lake of still black water ran out toward a horizon it never quite reached, scattered with lights that drifted like lanterns nobody was holding. The colors were almost right and not quite. A blue that leaned 1 degree too far toward gray. A silver that hummed faintly instead of just shining. I was not afraid. I noted that the way I'd note any other fact, Monopool 45 million, cannot cast a candle flame. Not afraid. I didn't know why. I filed it and moved on, because there wasn't anywhere else productive to put it. I tried, out of habit, to feel for my own pulse, and found nothing where a pulse should have been. No chest rising, no air moving in or out of anything. It should have alarmed me more than it did. I decided that was one more thing this place did to a person without asking permission first, and let it go the way I'd let the rest of it go. Sylph was sitting an arm's length away, on nothing that should have held his weight, looking exactly as unbothered as he always did. "You're here," I said. It came out flatter than I meant it. "I am." He left it there, the way he left most things there. I didn't ask how. Some questions you save for when the answer will actually change something, and this one wouldn't. Wherever I ended up, conscious or not, he found me. That part of my life had never once needed explaining, and it didn't start now. "Am I dead?" I asked, already fairly sure of the shape of the answer. "Define dead," said a woman's voice, from a direction that hadn't existed a moment before. Anita stood at the water's edge, the way she'd stood at the border dungeon's threshold. No wings, no light show, nothing that announced her as anything other than a plain woman in plain dark clothing who happened to be standing somewhere I couldn't leave. "I killed you," she said. No preamble. That was the whole sentence. I'd gathered. She let the silence sit a moment before she answered it. "Sit with that if you need to. You don't need to." I didn't. Whatever grief belonged to that fact had apparently already spent itself somewhere in the stretch of time I couldn't account for. Hours? Days? I had no way to measure it from inside this place. What was left when I checked for it was closer to arithmetic than sorrow. She lifted one hand, and the black water in front of us went from flat to a window. My own funeral looked exactly like every funeral I'd ever watched from a safe, invisible distance. Except this time, the coffin at the center of it was mine. The court kept its appropriate gravity, heads bowed at the correct angle. A formal reader working through a list of my titles nobody present had ever bothered using while I was alive to hear them. I already knew, without needing the water to confirm it, that the mourning would run exactly 3 days before the dining hall went back to its usual hour. I'd watched that same schedule play out once already, from the wrong side of the gates. This was the first time I was seeing what had actually happened on the other side of them. My mother knelt at the grave's edge, with both hands pressed flat against the stone, not moving them, not letting anyone move them them for her. I looked at her hands for exactly as long as it took to understand what they were doing. Then I looked away. Anita watched me look away and didn't comment on it, which was its own kind of mercy. My father stood behind her, one palm on her shoulder, and did not look like a man attending a funeral he'd arranged. My sister stood at his other side, dry-eyed, the same composure I'd already come to expect from her. I didn't ask the water to hold there longer. Some rooms I decided I didn't need more of than that. Anita didn't linger on it. That's the ceremony. Now the part you actually need to see. The water shifted again, down into the tomb itself, and showed me the coffin's interior with the same flat lack of ceremony she used for everything. My own body lay inside it, and it was not the fake I'd assumed the kingdom had buried in my place. It was mine, whole in some places, and unfinished in others. Skin knitting closed over a wound that shouldn't have existed on a corpse. A process running at the wrong speed for something that was supposed to be over. Watching my own hands finish healing themselves without me in them was a stranger feeling than watching my own funeral had been. The funeral, at least, was a thing other people were doing to a version of me that had already left. This was still in progress. This was still somehow mine to lose. "It's really me," I said, not a question. I needed to hear myself say it to believe it. Anita answered without softening it. "It was always really you. The restoration began earlier than it should have. It will finish by tomorrow night, and if it finishes before I'm back inside it, then something wearing your face gets up out of that coffin," she said. "It will not be you. It will not know it isn't you. Everyone who loved you will bury the version they can't get back a second time and never know they did it twice." I sat with that one a moment longer than the first fact she'd handed me. A body on a countdown was a different kind of problem than a body already gone. This one had a deadline, and deadlines were at least something I knew how to work with. "Anything else you're saving for later?" I said. Anita's answer came without hesitation. "Your stepmother Alara has been working against the hero, trying to keep your remains from ever being recovered at all, quietly. Nothing loud enough to trace back to her yet. One more front he's fighting that you aren't there to help him with." "Can I carry any of that for him?" I asked. "Any part of it?" "No," she said. "That cost is his contract, not yours. I don't share another god's arrangement, and I'd rather not be shouted at by the ones who'd notice if I did." Sylph made a small sound, halfway to a word, and didn't finish it. I let it go. Some things Sylph decided not to say, and I'd learned there was usually a reason. Anita didn't waste words. "Here are the terms." She didn't dress it up. "A body given back, restored, functioning, mine. A cost, real, not nothing. Collected later and not described now." I asked her to name it anyway, because it seemed like the kind of question a person should at least try. "Not yet," she said. "You'll know when I come for it." I ran the numbers the only way I had numbers to run them. A life I already knew how to survive without magic, without allies, without a name anyone would recognize, against an unnamed price I couldn't currently weigh against anything. It should have taken longer than it did. 19 years of a kingdom deciding, on the record and in front of witnesses, exactly what I was worth had at least taught me how to make a decision with incomplete information. I had done it before with less to work with than this. A mystery skill nobody could name. A body that couldn't cast a spell but never once ran out of anything to feed one. I had bet on myself under worse odds than an unnamed price tag, and won often enough to trust the habit. I decided I would build enough that whatever she eventually asked for, I could afford to pay it and keep going anyway. That was the whole decision. Not knowing the cost wasn't the same as refusing to make the bet. I was betting on what I could become, not on numbers I didn't have, and I told her so. "I accept," I said. For the first time since I'd woken in that place, something in Anita's stillness looked almost satisfied. Good. Then it's time to move quickly. Sylph didn't waste time on preamble. "The restoration hits its last moment before it locks in. I pull your body out through space itself in that same instant, and your soul goes back in while it's moving. There's no room to practice this. We get one try." "Then let's not waste it," I said. There wasn't a version of this where I rehearsed being brave about it. Anita's realm held me right up until it didn't, and the space between held and not held had no texture I could describe afterward. Not falling, not flying, just a threading of something too fast and too narrow to fully track. A needle finding its eye at a dead run. The next thing I had was weight, real weight, a body under me and around me, muscle across my face, pressing close enough that I couldn't see past it. I moved my fingers first. They worked. I moved my legs. They ached in a way legs ache after real use, not injury, and nothing in me screamed the specific wrongness of something broken. I ran the whole inventory the way I'd learned to. Hands Hands, legs, breath, pulse, all present, all mine. Even the ache felt like a gift, proof of a body doing ordinary, complaining, alive things. My voice came out muffled, pressed into what I now understood was Sylph's thigh. "You're squishing my face." Sylph sounded entirely too pleased with himself for a statement that should have been mine to be pleased about. "You're alive. Also, yes, my thighs. You're welcome." I sat up. Trees stood black against a sky just beginning to gray at its edges. A forest, not a tomb, not a lake, not anywhere the kingdom's mausoleum grounds should reasonably be. "Where are we?" I asked. Sylph stretched one arm over his head like he'd just finished a long swim rather than a rescue that could have ended either of us permanently. "About 10 kilometers out from the Royal Hill. You're weak enough right now that the pull went further than I planned for. I'm not complaining. Further is safer." Beside us sat a small collection of items I recognized before I understood how they'd gotten there. The coffin's contents, apparently, salvaged on the way out along with me. A black game board I used to play against Jill on rainy afternoons, the two of us arguing over rules neither of us fully remembered by the end. A small, unpleasant doll I'd kept on a shelf in my old room, the kind of ugly that made you keep it out of stubbornness rather than affection. An egg, warm, familiar, mine. A modest fortune in gold and silver coins that could only have come from one person, someone who apparently could not send her son into the ground, even a false ground, without also making sure he wouldn't go hungry wherever he ended up. "Keep the coins," I told Sylph. "You did the actual work tonight." He didn't argue, which told me how seriously he'd taken the whole thing. I picked up the doll out of habit more than curiosity and stopped. Its face had changed, not damaged, changed. The small stitched mouth sitting in a different line than the one I remembered. Something closer to resignation than the blank cheer it used to wear. I'd written about this thing once, in a diary I apparently wasn't getting back. A note that it had laughed at me once, for no reason I ever found, and that I'd decided to take it as a good sign rather than ask anyone what that meant. I didn't have a theory for what its new expression meant either. I set it down and decided, again, not to ask. "My diary," I said. "Is it in there?" Sylph checked, unhurried, and shook his head. "Not that I found. My mother has it," I said, mostly to myself. She'd taken it with her the night she found it in the antechamber and never left it behind. I hoped she'd found nothing in those pages worth repeating to anyone. I doubted I'd get that lucky. We started walking before the sky had finished deciding whether it was morning. Sylph explained the route in pieces as we went. The Royal Hill behind us, the border between Clambia and the federal kingdom of Terra Tecula somewhere ahead. 5 days of ground to cover on foot if we kept to the tree cover and moved mostly at night. I stopped at the first real stream we crossed to drink, and the water gave me back a face I didn't recognize. Hair the color of a winter sky where plain dark hair used to sit. Eyes a purple I couldn't place anywhere in my own bloodline. Not my mother's, not my father's, not any siblings I'd ever stood next to in the Hall of Truth. I touched my own jaw to be sure the water wasn't lying to me, and it wasn't. The face underneath the color was still mine. Same bones, same set to the mouth, but nobody glancing at me across a crowded room would have called it the dead prince's face anymore. "That's new," I said, more to the water than to Sylph. Sylph looked unbothered, like I'd changed cloaks rather than the face I'd worn my entire life. "Suits you." Guessing that's part of what she took, or gave. Depends how you want to file it. I filed it as both and kept walking. Whatever the cost of my return turned out to be, it had apparently already left a mark I could see in still water, and I decided I'd rather know that now than have it surface later as a surprise. Some while later, once the stream was well behind us, Sylph broke the quiet. "You'll need a name that isn't the one they buried." He wasn't wrong. Adrian was sealed in a tomb with a false diary and a kingdom's official record of his death. Whatever I built from here on, I was going to build it as someone the record hadn't already written an ending for. I turned the sound of it over for the better part of that night's walk, testing syllables the way you test a blade's balance before you trust it to a fight. By the time the sky started graying again, I had it. "Alphad," I said out loud, to see how it sat in my own mouth. Sylph turned the word over himself, testing its weight. "Alphad, better than what I would have picked. You weren't going to be asked." "Rude," he said, but accurate, and didn't argue further. I was slower than I wanted to be. However long it had actually been, I still had no honest way to measure it. A body that hadn't moved on its own in all that time was unconvinced it remembered how walking worked, and I said as much, more than once, more apologetically than the situation probably required. Sylph didn't let me finish apologizing. "Stop apologizing for being a person who just came back from being dead." He set to work without waiting for me to agree to it. A recovery charm first, warmth spreading through legs that had spent the last stretch of the night complaining, then something for the dark that made the forest's edges stop swimming, then a ward against anything with teeth that might be curious about two travelers moving mostly at night. You're spending a lot of effort on someone who can't even light a candle, I said. I'm spending your mana, not mine. He didn't even look up from the ward. Turns out I can pull straight from your reserve and cast with it myself, since you can't release a drop of it on your own. So really, you're doing all the work. I'm just better at aiming it. I tried it myself anyway, quietly. While Sylph was busy laying the ward, reached for the smallest scrap of that reserve and asked it to become anything at all. A flicker of light, a breath of warmth. Nothing answered. It never had. But I filed that fact next to the 45 million units sitting uselessly in my chest, and found, for the first time since the Hall of Truth had handed down its verdict on me, that uselessly might not be the permanent condition I'd assumed it was. Sylph looked entirely too pleased with himself. In exchange, you admire my muscles. Properly, out loud, when we've got the leisure for it. I already told you I refuse, I said. You'll come around. He just hummed something old and half familiar under his breath, a tune I hadn't heard since I was small enough to fall asleep to it, and didn't press me for an answer either way. We walked 4 more nights like that, Sylph humming, warding, occasionally teasing, never once asking me to be anything other than exactly as tired and slow as I actually was. On the 5th night, the trees broke open onto a cliff, and past it, nothing but a valley already giving itself over to dark, and, somewhere beyond that, the last lights of the only kingdom I'd ever called mine, small enough now to cover with one hand. I didn't have much left in me by then. 5 days, one body still learning to trust itself again, and a kind of tired that sat deeper than the legs. Sylph noticed before I said anything about it, the way he always did, and didn't wait to be asked. He carried me the last stretch of it, up through the last of the trees, without making a single joke about it, which told me more about how I must have looked than anything he could have said out loud. He set me down at the cliff's edge, gently, or as gently as a wind spirit built like a river boulder ever managed, and let the wind carry the rest of what neither of us needed to say out over the valley instead. The stone under me was cold, and the wind smelled like pine and distance, and somewhere behind my eyes, the whole 5 days finally caught up with me at once. We reached the barrier 2 mornings after the cliff, a wall of blue light climbing so high into the sky that it looked less like a wall and more like a second horizon somebody had forgotten to take down. Sylph didn't bother finding the gate. He grabbed my arm, said something short about a hole being faster than a line, and the world folded sideways for exactly as long as it took to put us on the other side of Clambia's border ward. The ward noticed. Alarms I couldn't see went up somewhere behind us, the air itself flashing the color of a bruise for one long second before the whole wall lit up in retaliation. "Move," Sylph said, and I moved, eggs already rattling loose from my coat pocket as the counterattack found the hole he'd torn and started pouring through it after us. I didn't try to dodge the first bolt. I never can dodge anything worth dodging. 45 million units of mana in me, and not one spell I can call up on my own. So instead, I did the only thing that skill has ever let me do. I stood where the magic was going to land and let it become something else. The bolt hit, and where a wound should have opened, an egg the size of a fist thumped into the grass at my feet instead. We ran until the barrier's reach gave out behind us, which took longer than either of us expected. Sylph whistled low at the wall of blue, still climbing into the morning at our backs. 3,000 meters. Didn't know it went that high. Neither had I, not until I'd measured it in scorch marks against my own sleeve. We'd have to use an actual gate to get back in someday, coin and paperwork, and a border guard's polite disinterest, since a hole in a national ward isn't the kind of thing you get to use twice. That was a problem for a version of me who wanted back in. I wasn't that version yet. Once we were clear, Sylph's idea of clear being considerably more relaxed than mine, I pulled the trick I'd been turning over since the 5th night of walking. I picked one of the eggs still warm in my pocket, took aim, and threw it at him as hard as I could. It caught him square in the shoulder and dropped him to one knee. "Ow," Sylph said, both hands going to the spot like I'd put a fist through it instead of an egg the size of a plum. What was that for? An experiment. Results. Promising. Sylph rubbed his shoulder, aggrieved. Results. I'm telling Anita you assaulted me the same week she brought you back. She'd probably approve. He grumbled something about ungrateful humans and their ungrateful little eggs. But he didn't argue when I told him what I actually meant, that if a stray shell could do that to a wind spirit built like a landslide, then everything the kingdom ever aimed at me from now on was doing me a favor, whether it meant to or not. We were in Terra Tequila territory by the time the sun cleared the tree line, a kingdom that had never held a hall of truth for me, never printed a verdict on what I was worth, never once heard the name Adrian. As far as this road was concerned, I was nobody at all. That was exactly the position I intended to build from. The first village didn't have an inn, which turned out to be the least surprising thing about that morning. I paid for breakfast with the last of the coin Sylph had carried out of the tomb for me, my mother's money, spent on flatbread and boiled eggs, in a place that had never heard either of our names, and spent the rest of the day hauling crates for a stallkeeper in exchange for a floor to sleep on. Nobody looked at me twice. Blue hair and a dead prince's official description didn't match, and that turned out to be the whole of my disguise. The truth had already done the work a lie would have had to do worse. I registered as a merchant 3 towns later under the name Alfred, with a card clean enough that no clerk anywhere had a reason to look past the ink. Behind that card, the operation ran itself. Every stray discharge of magic within reach of me, a spell gone wide, an argument that ended in sparks, a torch that guttered the wrong color. The field caught the runoff and turned it into an egg, small and forgettable. I hatched what I could use, sold what I couldn't, and let the rest collect at the bottom of my pack, like interest on a debt nobody else knew they owed me. The 4th town had an alchemist who paid real coin for a basket of the smaller, plainer eggs, dense little kernels of converted magic with no obvious use beyond the mana packed inside them. She didn't ask where they came from. She asked if I had more, and when I told her I could bring a fresh batch every few weeks, she gave me a standing order on the spot. That was the moment the operation stopped being something I did to survive and started being something with a shape of its own. Sylph peeled off 2 towns past the border, called back toward whatever he answers to along that stretch of wall. "Don't die doing something stupid," he said, which was as close as he'd ever come to admitting he'd missed the company. And then the wind shifted and he was gone. Somebody else picked up the thread before I'd finished missing him. Then somebody else after that. I stopped being surprised by the new faces and started paying attention instead to what each one was actually good for. One taught me to hold 50 eggs in the air at once without dropping a single one into a farmer's cart, which cost me a week I'd rather not describe in detail. Another showed me how to read a scrying spell's signature off the air before its caster ever got close enough to see me. By the time the rotation settled on a matched pair, calling themselves Val and Mira, I'd stopped waiting for the road to knock me down and started running it instead. 3 weeks into the rotation, with Val and Mira settled into the routine, I felt the hunters before I saw them. 3 separate scrying signatures blooming against the field like pinpricks of heat, all converging on the same stretch of road I was about to walk down. Ilara's network, most likely. Guild legitimate trackers, the kind who could requisition a scrying circle without anyone asking why. They weren't subtle, they didn't need to be. Nobody they'd hunted before had ever felt them coming first. "Mine," Val said, already grinning in a way that made me nervous for the hunters more than for myself. Mira elbowed past him. "Half mine." I told them what I wanted before either of them reached the crossroads. Nobody dead, nobody scarred where it would show. A missing hunting party gets a quiet report filed and forgotten. A dead one gets a kingdom asking questions in a much louder voice, and I wasn't ready to be the answer to those yet. Val didn't ask why. He just dropped the temperature of the crossroads by 20 degrees in the time it took the 3 hunters to notice something was wrong, and had them frozen solid to the eyebrows before their scrying circle finished its first pulse. Mira caught what they'd already thrown, one wild bolt of containment magic, flung the instant they realized they were losing, and folded it down into an egg the size of a fist before it finished traveling half the distance to my chest. Mira tossed it to me like a ball. Warm, still is, actually. Val questioned the middle one before the wipe took hold. Quick, clinical, no more force than necessary, and came back with exactly what I expected. The bounty traced 3 layers deep through a registered trappers guild before it reached a name that belonged to one of the queens still sitting comfortably in the capital. Ilara didn't like leaving her own name closer to the surface than that. They woke an hour later with the last day scrubbed clean from their memories. No worse for it beyond a headache, and a report they wouldn't be able to write with any confidence. I watched them stagger back the way they'd come, and felt something close to nothing at all. Not triumph, not mercy, just the flat satisfaction of watching an expensive plan produce exactly 0 results. Word of the hunter's failure took only a few days to reach wherever Ilara kept her ledgers. She answered with everything else she had. The bees didn't look like much at first. A gold shimmer over the rooftops, then a sound like a kettle deciding to become a storm. And then they were over the square in a column thick enough to blot out the sun's own glare. Hundreds of them, each one the size of my thumb, wings throwing off a light that had nothing natural about it. The square went from a market to a held breath in about 2 seconds. Someone dropped a crate of pottery. Someone else screamed a name that wasn't mine. And the heat coming off that many divine-grade wings at once was enough to make the air over the square shimmer like a road in high summer. Divine class. Alara's own. If half the stories about her bloodline were true, she'd spent whatever it cost to keep a swarm like that fed and controlled. And she'd spent it on me. People scattered. Val threw up a wall of ice between the swarm and a child who hadn't moved fast enough. Mira swore in a language I didn't recognize and reached for a spell she never got to finish. Because by then, the bees had already found me. They stung. I want to be precise about that part because it matters. They stung the way any venomous thing stings, fast and many times over. And for the length of one held breath, I genuinely believed I was about to learn what dying a second time felt like. Then the venom hit the field instead of my blood. Venom, spell, or curse. It was all just mana to the part of me that mattered. And mana turns into eggs no matter what shape it arrives in. Every single sting came out the other side of me as one. I stood in the middle of that square with eggs raining softly off my shoulders and forearms and the back of my neck. Dozens of them, then closer to 100, gold-shelled and warm enough that the ones on the ground actually steamed. A stray discharge caught the awning over a fruit stall and should have burned it to nothing. Instead, the flame guttered, folded in on itself, and dropped onto the cobblestones as one more egg, small and blackened at the shell. Even the collateral damage was paying me. The bees kept coming. I kept converting. Somewhere in the middle of it, Val stopped throwing ice and just watched, open-mouthed, which from a special grade spirit is its own kind of review. The swarm broke off when whatever instructions its queen had given it ran out of venom worth spending. It didn't retreat so much as give up, the gold column thinning and scattering back the way it came, leaving the square quiet except for the sound of eggs settling against cobblestones. I picked one up. It was heavier than any egg I'd ever hatched, dense in a way that had nothing to do with size, and it smelled, faintly, of something sweet enough to make my mouth water without my permission. Divine class honey, medical grade, category 1, the kind of thing 14 recorded instances existed of in the entire written history of the trade guilds, all of them locked in vaults. None of them for sale. I now had one. Alara had spent one of her most expensive weapons on a single fugitive. Her return on that investment, nothing. Mine. Enough capital to matter for the rest of the year. Once I broke it into pieces, small enough not to attract the kind of attention a whole jar of it would have. I didn't gloat. There wasn't anyone left to gloat at. I just filed the whole afternoon under things that had gone better than they had any right to. I had the same conversation 3 times, in 3 different towns, with 3 different apothecaries who each believed he was the only one lucky enough to be offered a sliver of what I was selling. None of them haggled long. One held his piece up to the lamp and went quiet for a full minute before naming a price that made his own assistant flinch. Another asked no questions at all, which told me he already knew exactly what he was looking at and preferred not to know how I'd come by it. The third simply paid, wrapped it, and asked if I had more. I didn't have more to give him. What I did have was already extraordinary enough without saying the count out loud. One queen's entire assassination budget turned into enough capital to fund the rest of the year twice over, spread across 3 ledgers that would never think to compare notes. Alfred's guild card went into all 3 of them clean, unremarkable, with no history behind it worth flagging. Nobody had a reason to ask why the same young merchant kept turning up with something nobody else in the region could source. The rumor about Baldwin reached me the ordinary way rumors reach a merchant, through a contact who traded information the same way he traded everything else, for a fair price, and no questions asked. He slid a folded paper across the counter without looking up from the ledger he was balancing. Word from the capital, if you're still buying. Always, I said. He didn't look up. First Prince's Thunder contract. Renewals stalled. Word is, the spirits involved won't sign again. I read it twice before I let myself believe it meant what it said. Baldwin had built the whole case against me on exactly 3 bound thunder spirits, held up in front of the full council as proof of what a prince was supposed to be able to do that I couldn't. Spirit contracts don't lapse on their own, I said, half to him and half to myself. They lapse when whoever's holding them has spent the goodwill down to nothing. He shrugged. A man who dealt in gossip rather than motive. That's above my pay. Not above mine. Baldwin had leaned on those three spirits for years, parading them in council chambers as proof of what a prince should be, spending them on political theater the original bargain never covered. Spirits keep better records than any court does. Sooner or later, the ones he'd used noticed the gap between what they'd agreed to and what he'd actually spent them on, and they'd decided not to renew. "There's a footnote too," he said, still not looking up, "if it's worth anything to you. First prince petitioned the registry himself to force the renewal through. Got refused. A prince without new results to show for himself doesn't get to overrule a spirit's stated will, not even one whose name used to open every door in the capital." "That's public record?" I asked. "Filed with the magical registry, same as any contract. I'm not telling you anything a clerk with an afternoon free couldn't find himself." He finally looked up. "Personal interest in the first prince's paperwork? Professional curiosity," I said. "I like watching debts come due." He didn't push it, which was the whole reason I traded with him, and not the dozen louder merchants in the same town. I paid him for the tip and folded the paper into my coat next to the egg that never went cold. They had spent 19 years telling me exactly what I was worth. Watching the math start to run the other way, one small failure at a time, was worth more than anything that mirror in the Hall of Truth had ever printed about either of us. 3 failed operations in one season, a bounty crew that couldn't remember losing, a swarm that funded the very fugitive it was sent to kill, and a first prince's own contracts quietly falling apart without my having to lift a hand toward any of it. Nobody back home knew any of it traced to me. That was the whole point of doing it this way. The road ahead bent toward a place called Menemes, high in the mountains, where I'd heard a person could register a proper trading operation instead of running one out of a coat pocket. That was worth walking toward. "You've got to look," Mira said, watching me sideways. "What look?" Mira tilted her head. "Like you're already 3 moves past whatever just happened." I didn't answer that, because she wasn't wrong, and because some things prove themselves better than they explain. I had a pack heavier with eggs than coin, a guild card with no history on it yet, and a kingdom that still believed it had buried its problem successfully. For now, that was enough to walk on. Walking turned out to mean waking up most mornings with no memory of what my own camp would look like by sunrise. That particular morning, it looked like a block of ice with a tent somewhere inside it. I found the door by feel, cracked it open, and stepped into a room I recognized. My own old bedroom in the Clambia Palace, or close enough to fool me for a full 3 seconds, carved entirely out of frost. Val was floating near the ceiling, tossing something small and unpleasant looking between his hands. Mira sat cross-legged on what used to be my bed, keeping score on a slate. "Morning," Val said, not looking away from the toy. "You slept through the fun part." I asked what the fun part had been. "There was a guild," Mira said. "Now there is a guild frozen from the neck down. They'll thaw by next week, mostly." I had learned, over the last several days, not to ask follow-up questions when Mira used the word mostly. Instead, I made breakfast, which she scored a +1 for competence, and then took right back with a -1 for sighing while doing it. Val explained, without being asked, that anything under -10 and the 2 of them would simply leave me to finish the walk alone. A threat delivered so cheerfully, it took me longer than it should have to realize it was real. Sylph, at least, had only ever teased me. These 2 ran an economy. We broke camp before the ice fully melted. Val wanted to reach Central City by nightfall. From there, a proper caravan route ran straight through to Menemes, and I was tired of walking roads that didn't have names. Mira agreed, on the condition that whatever happened next involved fewer dolls. I didn't ask what she meant by that. Some questions I was learning were not worth the answer. Central City announced itself the way most capitals did. A wall taller than made sense, a line at the gate longer than made sense, and a smell of too many cook fires trying to outcompete each other. Val and Mira dropped their spirit shapes at the tree line outside the wall, the way another traveler might have changed clothes. What stepped out of the light instead of a pair of ice spirits was a devastatingly handsome young man and an equally striking young woman, both of them entirely too pleased with themselves about it. "Better," Val said, admiring his own hands. "Try not to get us noticed," Mira told me, which struck me as a strange thing to say while standing next to the 2 most noticeable people I had ever traveled with. We passed through the gate without trouble. Nobody in Central City was looking for a dead prince with blue hair and a rabbit hood. They were looking at Val and Mira, the way a crowd looks at a fire it isn't standing on. I let them do the looking. It was, by now, a comfortable kind of invisible. We found the finest inn in the merchant quarter by the simple method of following the smell of roasted merlepen steak, and went in to eat. The Keelan beastman at the next table noticed me before I noticed him. He had the build of someone built for running rather than fighting, a pair of small back-swept horns, and eyes the color of warm honey that fixed on me like he already knew me. When our server passed close enough, he leaned across and asked, with no preamble at all, whether the seat beside me was taken. It wasn't. He sat. "Camille," he said, offering a hand. "I don't usually do this. Introduce myself to strangers. I gave him the name I gave everyone, Alfred. He tried it out twice, decided he liked Al better, and started using it before I'd agreed to anything. He'd come to the city with a companion of his own, an elf woman who'd already gone up to bed, tired from the road, but he didn't seem to need her there to feel easy with strangers. Val ordered enough food for 4 people and ate like he was being timed. Mira, watching him, awarded me 2 points for not commenting on it, a system I had stopped questioning and started simply accepting, the way you accept weather. Somewhere between the skewered cactus and the second round of Ice Spirit's sigh, I asked Camille, mostly out of politeness, what he actually liked to eat. He lit up like I'd asked him something enormous. He answered at length. I listened, ordered 2 of the dishes he'd named, and split them with him without thinking twice about it. It was easier than choosing my own, and he seemed happy about the company. Across the table, Val went very quiet, and Mira's eyebrows climbed somewhere near her hairline. I didn't understand why until much later. That night, I only registered that dinner had gone unusually well, and that I liked him. By the time the plates were cleared, the sky outside had gone the color of a bruise healing, orange at the edges, purple pulling in from the sea. Camille asked if I'd ever watched the sunset from a rooftop. I said I hadn't, not properly, not in longer than I wanted to think about. Then you should, he said, tonight, with me. I said yes before I'd finished deciding to. The roof looked out over the harbor, and the harbor was on fire with the last of the light. I hadn't sat still and looked at anything for pleasure in longer than I could easily count. It felt strange, in a good way, like a muscle I'd forgotten I owned. Camille sat close enough that our shoulders touched and didn't seem inclined to apologize for it. I have to tell you something, he said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything back. I told him to go ahead. He told me he'd been in love before, a Chilean man, older, from a caravan he'd traveled with 2 winters back, and that it hadn't gone anywhere, and that he'd more or less decided love wasn't going to happen for him a second time. Then I'd asked what he liked to eat, and ordered his favorite dishes instead of picking my own. And now here we were, watching the sun go down together on a roof he hadn't invited just anyone up to. He was quiet for a second, like he was deciding how much more to say. Where I'm from, that's not a small thing, he said finally. Asking what someone loves, eating what they love, watching the sky end with them. Put those 3 together and you've said something, whether you meant to or not. I opened my mouth to tell him I hadn't meant anything at all, that I'd asked because I was curious, ordered because it was easier, and come up here because the view sounded nice. And then I looked at him. He was glowing. Actually glowing, the particular glow of someone who has decided, against their own experience, to be happy again. I didn't say any of it. Instead, we sat there while the color drained out of the water, and he pointed out a formation of bats crossing far out over the harbor, wheeling and reforming like something choreographed. I didn't mention that I'd traveled with people who could do worse to a flock of bats than admire them. I told myself I'd correct it tomorrow, gently, in daylight, when it wouldn't land like a slap. I told myself a lot of things, watching that sun go down, and none of them were the truth Camille deserved to hear. When full dark came, he suggested we go find Val for a bath before the suite room's tub cooled. I said I'd meet them, that I wanted to change first, that in my country, it wasn't proper to share quarters before a proper ceremony. Every word of it technically true. None of it the reason I actually wanted my own room for the night. He accepted it without a flicker of doubt. That was somehow worse than if he'd argued. "Don't take too long," he said, and kissed my knuckles, and went. I walked to my own room, already composing the honest conversation I still, somehow, did not have. My room was dark when I reached it, which wasn't strange. Rooms are dark until you light them. I found the lamp by memory, struck it, and the light came up just in time for me to see a shape already standing against the far wall, where no shape should have been. I knew the face before I understood what I was looking at. I'd seen it across formal dinners I'd mostly tried to disappear from, a few years and a lifetime ago. A half-brother I'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in my entire life, Gollin. I didn't get further than his name. He crossed the room faster than anything with a mortal body should move, and then he was behind me, and then his teeth were in my neck. Cold first. Cold spreading out from the bite like ice water, finding every vein at once. I tried to throw an elbow back into him. My arm didn't answer. I tried again, and it wasn't that the command failed. It was that the command simply stopped being mine to give, like a rope cut clean instead of pulled from my hands. Then a flat, colorless notice, the kind my own skill used to hand me when it was too tired to bother with drama. Vampirism. an ability that allows the biter to control the bitten, then a gap where the rest of me should have been. I came back to myself in pieces, the way you surface underwater when you've gone down too far to remember which way was up. A piece of it, my own hand, closing around a shard of the broken washstand, swinging it at someone I would have died rather than hurt. A piece of it. Val's voice, no longer bothering to sound amused, shouting Mira's name. A piece of it. The room full of bats that weren't bats, black and cold, and smelling faintly of grave dirt, pouring out of Colin like his skin had stopped being a container. He'd stopped being a young man standing in a doorway. He was mist and wings, and a dozen directions at once. And somewhere in the middle of that, still recognizably him, his voice, saying something I couldn't hold on to long enough to understand. None of it was mine to stop. I felt every blow before I threw it and hated every one of them and threw them anyway, because whatever was steering me didn't ask my opinion first, and every single blow, landed or taken, it didn't seem to matter which, came apart into an egg. Val's ice caught my swing and cracked into 100 cold, round shells before it finished cracking my arm. One of Colin's bats hit me square in the chest and became 3 eggs on impact, already splitting, already hatching, something small and wet, and unbothered by the chaos, crawling out onto the floorboards. I hit Mira with a chair leg I hadn't chosen to pick up, and the chair leg became eggs too, an entire clutch of them, raining down around her boots. One of the bats caught Val hard enough across the face to spin him half around. He shook it off before I could feel properly afraid for him, spirit flesh knitting back together in the time it took him to spit and swear. But for one bad second, the fight stopped being funny for anyone in the room. It didn't stop after that. My skill had never needed my permission to work, and under that many hits landing that fast, it simply didn't stop. Every impact came apart into another shell, then another, until the eggs weren't scattering anymore. They were piling, ankle deep, and then knee deep and climbing. A slow, absurd tide of shell and yolk and small, startled hatchlings rising around all 4 of us, while 2 spirits and a mind-controlled prince tried to kill each other in the middle of it. "He's not going to stop on his own," Val called out, and it was the first time all trip I'd heard him sound like he meant something. Mira didn't answer with words. Frost bloomed up both her arms, and she put it into Colin instead of into me. A decision I understood later was the harder one to make correctly, in the dark, at speed, without killing either of us by mistake. Colin's mist seized midair and turned to ice from the inside out. He hit the floor solid, arms still half raised, encased from scalp to boot in something that looked like glass and wasn't. The moment his hold broke, mine went with it. I felt the strings drop out of my own limbs all at once, and the last thing I registered before the floor came up to meet me through what must have been 3 feet of eggshell was Val's arm catching me before I finished the fall. What woke me was pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm, except it was pressing on something behind my eyes instead. I came up out of the dark to find the whole room encased in a second skin of light, black at the edges, and threaded through with something that looked disturbingly like veins. Val was crouched beside me, Mira standing over Colin's frozen shape with her arms crossed, and at the center of the new barrier stood 2 people I had never met, and immediately understood outranked everyone else present. Val had muttered on the way up out of unconsciousness, or maybe I only imagined it, half lucid as I was, that whatever had just happened was big enough to call in real authority. Spirits senior enough that an oath sworn in front of them actually meant something, and other spirits, dark and holy alike, would notice if it broke. The dark one didn't so much stand as loom, patient and unhurried, in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. The pale one beside him looked, by contrast, faintly bored, as if he'd rather be anywhere else, and had made his peace with not being. "He's awake," Mira said, not looking away from Colin. "Good, ask him what he wants us to do before Mobe gets started." I didn't get the chance to ask what she meant by started. The dark spirit, Mobe, apparently, raised one hand toward the ice, holding Colin, and the ice thinned to something Colin could speak through, though not move through. "Tell me your purpose," Mobe said. It wasn't a request. The words landed with actual weight, like a hand pressed flat against Colin's chest. Colin fought it. I watched him fight it, jaw locked, throat working, and lose anyway, the way everyone in that room but Moby was clearly going to lose if it came to a real contest. What came out of him wasn't a confession about Miranda, or a mission, or any of the things I'd have guessed if you'd asked me an hour earlier who might want me dead a second time. It was smaller than that, and worse. He said, forced out of him one broken piece at a time, that he wasn't like me. Whatever had let me walk back out of a death that should have finished me, he didn't have it, and never would. A half-vampire's blood bought him nothing but a longer, ordinary span before the same ordinary ending everyone else got. He'd watched me die once already, from a tree line he never stepped out of. He'd told himself for years the reason he never called out to stop it was tactical, unavoidable, someone else's fault. Then word reached him that I hadn't stayed dead, and the excuse stopped covering it. Finding me hadn't even been especially hard in the end. A merchant guild card with no history, moving unusual volumes of a certain rare honey through 3 separate towns, was exactly the kind of rumor a desperate, well-funded half-vampire prince had the resources to chase down. Given enough years to spend on it, he needed to know if it was real. He needed to know if there was a way to want to survive that didn't end the way every other way he knew about ended. He hadn't trusted that asking a stranger he barely shared blood with would get him a true answer, so he'd taken the one method he did trust, the kind where the truth wasn't optional. He hadn't come for Miranda. He hadn't come for anyone but himself. Out of a fear so plain and so human, it made the whole shadow magic entrance feel almost beside the point. I had spent a long time being angry at a shape in a tree line, at whoever had watched Seth's blade come down and done nothing, said nothing, let it happen, and then walked away to report it like a completed errand. I had never once pictured that shape as someone scared. It was easier, honestly, to have hated a schemer. A schemer made sense of the silence. A boy too frightened of his own dying to risk anything on someone else's just made the whole memory sadder, not simpler. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Even Val looked briefly like he didn't know what to do with that. Then Lopolis, who had said nothing this entire time, finally spoke, in the tone of someone mentioning it might rain. "Why not just introduce him to the goddess of life?" he said. Instead of all this, Moab turned his head slowly, the way you'd look at someone who had just solved a problem you'd been about to make much more complicated. "That," Moab said, "is an excellent question." Moab considered Colin for a long moment before answering Lopolis's question with terms instead of agreement. "You will protect him," Moab said to Colin. "You will keep whatever secrets are his to keep. You will stand as his strength when he needs one. Do this faithfully, and once you are fully grown, I will take you before the goddess of life myself and ask her to consider you for what you came here hunting." Lopolis, from somewhere behind him, added that the goddess deciding yes was not part of the deal, only the asking. "It's not friendship," Moab said. To Colin or to me, I was never sure which. "It's not forgiveness for the tree line. It's a trade you both need badly enough to take on faith." Colin, still half frozen, still shaking from whatever it cost him to be pulled apart like that in front of strangers, said yes before Moby finished the last word. I hadn't been asked anything yet. I found, once I was, that I already knew my own answer. "What do you want done with him?" Val asked me, quiet. None of his usual performance in it. I looked at my half-brother, kneeling in a puddle of his own melting ice. Someone who'd spent years too afraid of dying to ever once say so out loud. Who'd tried to solve that fear by turning me into a weapon rather than asking me a single honest question. I thought about how easy it would have been for someone standing where I stood to let the spirits do whatever spirits did with people who broke into rooms and bit princes. "I don't want him killed," I said. "Whatever else is true between us, that's not a door I want opened." Nobody argued with me. Moab inclined his head once, like a signature on something already decided. Colin didn't look at me at all, but something in his shoulders came down an inch, the way a held breath finally lets go. We had never once, in either of our lives, spoken to each other as brothers. He had watched me die without a word, and I had just finished spending an evening trying to figure out how to gently break someone else's heart. And neither of those were the kind of history that made forgiveness simple. I wasn't offering him that. I was only refusing to let the easiest, cleanest ending be the one that happened to him in a room I was standing in. It would have to be enough, for tonight, that I'd meant it. The barrier dropped a moment later, black light peeling back to ordinary gray dawn leaking through the shutters. And with it went every trace of the night's authority and menace. What was left in the room was 2 exhausted ice spirits, 1 thoroughly rattled half-vampire, and roughly a small mountain of eggs, some of them still hatching, filling every inch of floor that wasn't already occupied by furniture. Mira looked at the eggs. Then she looked at me. "You did this." I pointed out, reasonably, that I hadn't exactly been driving at the time. "Doesn't matter," Val said, already looking a great deal more cheerful than the situation warranted. "Skill's yours. Mess is yours. You're hatching every single one of them by hand before anybody in this room sleeps." I looked at the eggs again. There were, conservatively, hundreds of them, and more shifting under the pile as I watched. "That's not a punishment," I said. "That's a war crime." -1, Mira said, for whining, and handed me the first egg. Somewhere past the shuttered window, the sky over Central City was turning the color of a fresh bruise into the color of mourning, and Menemes was still 2 days off, and my half-brother was asleep against the wall with a spirit's oath wrapped around him like a leash he'd asked for. None of it was resolved the way I'd have chosen, if anyone had asked me first. But I had a room full of eggs to hatch, a brother who hadn't left, and a conversation with Camille that still hadn't happened. That, at least, was a problem for tomorrow. Tomorrow, it turned out, meant 4 hours of sleep and a room that hadn't gotten any smaller. I opened my eyes, buried in the same drift of eggs I'd apparently fallen asleep hatching, cracked one open with the heel of my hand, and started counting again from wherever I'd left off the night before. Somewhere past 600, I'd stopped bothering with the number. Colin was awake before I finished the next dozen, watching me with the flat, assessing look he used for everything, including breakfast. "You've gotten faster," he said. "Faster than you should have, this soon." He was right, in the way he usually was. Eggs at the far side of the room, ones I hadn't touched, hadn't even glanced at, started drifting toward me on their own, like the skill had decided fetching them itself was more efficient than waiting for me to walk over. I hadn't asked it to do that. I hadn't asked it to do any of this. That had never stopped it before. Mobe arrived while I was still deciding whether to be unsettled by it, looked at the drifting eggs the way a man checks a ledger he already trusts, and confirmed what Colin had already worked out. The skill grows the same way anything does, from being used past the point of comfort. He didn't stay to discuss it further. He had somewhere to be. Colin's own family needed a reason for their son's sudden absence, and searching for a path to immortality was, technically, true enough to serve as one. He told Colin to stay with me. He told me nothing at all. He was gone before I'd finished the sentence I'd been building to object with. "You could have let me argue first," I said, to the space where he'd been standing. Colin didn't look up from sorting the wreckage. "You'd have lost. What the hatch left behind, once I'd gone through it, was worth more than I wanted to add up before breakfast. A tool built for forcing evolution that clearly had opinions about how it got used. 3 separate items I couldn't safely explain to anyone at a dinner table, and enough raw magic stone to make the whole exhausting night worth the mana headache. I kept all of it." Colin didn't argue. He never did when it came to keeping things. By the time the last egg cracked, the sun was properly up, and Colin had found somewhere in the wreckage a strip of dried meat he insisted on splitting evenly between us, down to the exact bite. It wasn't much of a breakfast. It was the first one we'd split evenly, and neither of us mentioned it. Menams ran its guilds differently than the border towns I'd gotten used to. Adventuring came first here, merchants standing second. The clerk explained it without my asking, in the bored voice of someone who'd said it 1,000 times that week alone. "You proved you could survive a monster before anyone let you move goods, because a trader who couldn't defend his own shipment was a trader who got robbed, and a country full of robbed traders was bad for tax revenue. It was, I had to admit, a more honest system than the one I'd grown up under. I registered as Alphid, point of origin, the border region. Technically accurate since nobody had thought to ask which side of it I meant. The clerk didn't blink at any of it. A man with no guild history anywhere in the kingdom's records read to her, as a foreigner, finally getting around to making things official, unusual, not suspicious, the kind of gap in the paperwork that raised no flags because it matched 100 other travelers' gaps exactly. She stamped the form, took her fee in silver, and slid a card across the counter that turned the last several months of pretending to be a merchant into something with an official seal pressed into it. Colin watched the whole transaction with the expression of someone filing away exactly how the system worked for later use. "You'll need the merchant registration too," he said, "once this one clears." "I know how empires get built," I told him. "One stamp at a time. That's a strange thing to find satisfying. You'll understand it eventually." Val and Mira's rotation ended at that same crossing stone, and they told me so the way they told me most things, without much ceremony. Their affiliation ran to the border region, not to Menemes. The network here belonged to other spirits now, and staying past your assignment wasn't loyalty, Val said. It was just bad manners toward whoever was supposed to take over. "Don't get soft about it," Mira told me, which was as close as she'd ever come to admitting she'd missed the arrangement. Val cuffed the side of my head hard enough to be affectionate. "Score's frozen where it stands. Consider that your parting gift." He told me I'd better keep getting stronger, since he intended to hear about it from other spirits later and be smug about having called it early. Then they were gone. Not a long goodbye, not a short one either, just exactly the size of what they'd actually been to me. I stood there a moment, feeling the gap where 2 people who'd frozen a royal bounty team for my sake used to be. It didn't stay empty long. Sylph, who hadn't gone anywhere, he never did, made the introductions in his usual handful of words. Tiza, an earth spirit, old and visibly annoyed about having to work for it. Acnea, water, loud, and already asking a passing merchant where the local liquor was sold. Menemez ran on its own spirit network, same as Anywhere did, and Sylph had apparently known exactly who'd be covering me next long before I'd thought to ask. Colin, for his part, had acquired something of his own over the last several days. A stray bit of magic stone alchemy that had imprinted on him during an idle afternoon spent testing a hammer built for forcing evolution, growing in under a week from a formless, grateful little lump into a small black bat-shaped thing he'd named Dios. It rode his shoulder now, wings folded, wary of everyone in the group but him. Tiza took one look at the small mountain of luggage Val and Mira left behind and sighed like the work had personally wronged her. Aknia just laughed and shouldered half of it without being asked. Camille found me before I'd finished setting down my pack. "I've been thinking," he said, hands twisting together in a way that told me he'd rehearsed this more than once, "about how I've been clingy. I never asked what any of this meant where you're from. I just decided what I needed it to mean and made you live inside that decision. I'm sorry. Please don't disappear on me again. I don't think I could stand it a second time." I opened my mouth to answer him honestly, finally, the way I should have weeks ago. I could feel the actual words lining up. Plain ones, the ones I owed him, for maybe half a second before Colin got there first. He crossed the room fast enough that I felt the air move, caught Camille by the collar, and slammed him back against the wall hard enough to rattle the shelf above it. "Let go of him," he said, low and flat. "You don't understand what he survived to get here. You don't get to make that your tragedy. Colin, you think this is love?" He wasn't shouting, which was somehow worse. "This is you deciding you're owed something because you're sad." He'd sworn 3 days ago to protect me from anything that threatened me, and nobody had taught him yet how to tell an actual threat from a complication he didn't like the shape of. Camille was neither. That didn't seem to matter in the moment. I should have pulled him off right then. I told myself I was choosing not to, and some smaller part of me knew that was only half true. The other half was relief that someone else was willing to end the conversation I didn't have the nerve to finish. Camille didn't fight him. He touched a hand to his own collar, where Colin's grip had left it crooked, and said nothing in his own defense, looking more heartbroken by Colin's fury than he had by anything else that night. I got a hand on Colin's arm. That's enough. It wasn't enough, as far as Colin was concerned. He hauled me backward by the wrist instead, not gently, and the door to the private room slammed shut behind us before I'd gotten a full sentence of protest out. "I was talking to him," I said. "You were about to be honest with him, standing in a room full of people who'd repeat it by morning." Colin's jaw was tight, his hands not quite steady. "Let me do this my way. Once. I could have overruled him. I outranked him in every practical sense that mattered, and we both knew it. But the oath was 3 days old, and the trust underneath it was younger than that. And picking this particular fight over this felt like exactly the wrong place to spend it. "Fine," I said. "Once." He put me to sleep instead of arguing further. A small, unglamorous spell, gone before I could tell him not to use it. My last clear thought was that he'd meant every bit of it kindly, and that being cared for like this still felt uncomfortably close to being managed. Colin picked the worst possible moment to be hungry. We'd stopped to water the mounts. He came up behind me without asking, the way he always did now, tilted my head aside and bit down. A quick thing, over almost before it started, more a vampire's version of a hug than anything that should have hurt. It wasn't the first time. It had started days ago, an odd custom the spirits called harmless, and I'd more or less stopped noticing when it happened. Camille saw it happen from 10 feet away. He didn't say anything at first. He crossed the distance, put 2 fingers to the mark before it had finished closing, and healed it anyway, his hands not quite steady while he did it. An old habit, gentleness, reflexive, even when his face had already gone tight with something that wasn't gentle at all. Then he turned on Colin. "You do that in front of me, every time." His voice shook. "Do you enjoy it?" "I don't do anything for your benefit," Colin said. That should have been my moment to step between them again. Instead, I stood there, and the silence stretched long enough that Camille read it correctly, the way people usually read the things you're too much of a coward to say out loud. Al, just my name, just that. Tell me it's not what it looks like. I thought about every gentler version of this sentence I'd rehearsed in my head over the last several weeks, and discarded every one of them as a way of making myself feel better instead of making this easier for him. There wasn't a kind way left. There was only a direct one. "I don't love you," I said. "Not the way you need me to. I never meant for you to believe I did, and I let it go on far longer than I should have, and I'm sorry for every day of it." He laughed, short and wrong. "That's not. We watched the sunset. You asked what I like to eat. That means something, where I'm from. It should have meant something here too. It just wasn't the thing you thought it was. You're lying." His voice had gone very small. "Tell me you're lying." I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't have been a second, smaller cruelty. Camille's knees went first. He didn't fall so much as fold, all at once, both hands pressed flat to the ground, like the earth might still be arguable if he held on hard enough. I crouched beside him and he let me, which was somehow worse than if he'd pushed me away. Colin, for once, didn't look triumphant. He looked like someone who'd wanted this over with and hadn't expected it to feel like this once it actually was. Even Dios, riding his shoulder, had gone still and quiet, wings folded flat, as if it understood exactly what its rider had just helped cause and wasn't sure yet how to feel about it. Tiza and Acnea arrived in the middle of it, unhurried, the way spirits tended to arrive at exactly the moment their opinion wasn't wanted. "How troublesome," said Tiza, the one made of packed gray stone, her voice announcing itself over Camille's shoulder. "Matters of love get simple with a little time. Simplest if you just knock him out," said the other, already digging through a pack for something that smelled like liquor. "Say your piece. If he whines after, hit him again." It should have been funny. It wasn't. Not with Camille shaking under my hands. But I understood, dimly, that the joke wasn't for me. It was the release valve the moment needed, so nobody drowned in it. Camille didn't say anything else that day. He let Tiza half carry him back toward camp, and I watched him go without following, because for once, following would only have made it about me. Camille was already packed when I woke. He didn't look at me right away, busy checking a saddle strap that didn't need checking, giving his hands something honest to do. When he finally did look up, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and something in his face had settled into a kind of quiet I hadn't seen on him before. "I'm not angry," he said. "I want you to know that. I spent most of the night being angry, and I ran out. You're allowed to stay angry. I'd understand it. I know." He tightened the strap one more notch than it needed. "I lost someone once before you. Properly lost him. A knife, not a misunderstanding. I think some part of me decided you were a second chance at something I never actually got to finish grieving the first time. That's not fair to you. It was never really about you at all." I didn't have an answer for that worth saying out loud. He didn't seem to want one. He'd already said what he needed to say, the way people do when they've spent a whole night deciding exactly how they intend to leave. "I'm going west," he said. "There's a guild post that way that always needs riders. I'll be fine, Al. I was fine before you too." He hugged me once, brief and steady. None of the desperation from the rooftop left in it. Just a goodbye, given cleanly, the way I hadn't managed to give him the truth. Then he mounted up and rode west without looking back, and I stood there in the cold, watching a road that had one fewer person on it than it had the day before. Menemesa itself deserved a longer look than I gave it. Snow-capped peaks, even in the warm months, ice spirits doing tricks in the market squares for coin, a city that had figured out how to sell its own weather to travelers. I filed it away for later and took Colin straight to the guild hall instead, because Dios had stopped being small and formless sometime in the last week, and I wanted to know what it had actually become. It didn't look like the shapeless little thing Colin had first shown me. Wings now, thin, membranous, black as old ink, folded tight along a body still too small for them, with eyes that tracked the room like it was already calculating distances. The evaluator ran her hands over it twice, checked a heavy reference book, then checked it again. Behind her, a line of adventurers waiting their turn had started listening in, the way people do when a routine appointment stops sounding routine. "The lineage reads as a standard liquid mana stone familiar," she said. "Low tier, common enough that we don't usually bother evaluating past first bonding." She frowned at whatever page she'd landed on. "This isn't that anymore. The growth rate's wrong. The configuration's wrong. I have a category for what it started as. I don't have one for what it is right now." Colin looked pleased about this in a way that had nothing to do with understanding it. Sylph, who'd said maybe 6 words since we'd crossed into Menemus, drifted closer to Dios and studied it with an attention he didn't usually spend on anything that wasn't me directly. That, more than the evaluator's confusion, was the part that stayed with me. Every creature that orbits him seems to grow. I hadn't said it out loud. I didn't know yet if it was true, but I filed the thought anyway, the way I filed most things that might matter later. Dios had grown up fast beside a field of ambient mana running at 45 million units, and never once switching off. And Dios wasn't the only living thing that had spent long stretches near that field these last months. I didn't have an explanation yet. I had a filed note and an evaluator writing anomalous progression onto a form that would sit in a drawer until somebody needed it. Registration meant access, and access meant I finally had a reason to stop rationing the field. I ran it at close to full capacity for the first time since we'd arrived. Every egg I'd been sitting on, plus plus whatever the last several days on the road had added. All of it hatched in one long push, instead of drawn out carefully over a week the way I'd been doing since Central City. It filled 2 guild vault cases before I ran out of flat surfaces to lay things on. Not just the volume, the range. Alchemical components from 3 different categories. Weapon-grade materials in quantities that would have been a small fortune on their own. A scattering of magic stones large enough to matter. One item the appraiser handled like it might still be listening to the room. Everything my operation had ever touched, represented in a single afternoon. The guild's own appraiser took the better part of an hour just cataloging it, and twice had to send for a second opinion on something he didn't recognize. Manim's guild law wouldn't let me sell it to one buyer, even if I'd wanted to. A haul that size going to a single hand got treated as an attempt to corner the market, and the questions that followed weren't ones I wanted asked. So I split it 3 ways, plus a direct consignment through the guild itself, and watched the totals land in a ledger I'd been keeping faithfully since the dungeon days. A habit left over from years spent as a child, watching the palace's accounts department work through its own books, while nobody thought a deprioritized prince was paying attention to anything. Colin read the final sum over my shoulder and went quiet in the specific way that meant he was recalculating something about who exactly he'd sworn himself to. It wasn't a fortune yet. It was the first quarter of one, on paper, with my name, my other name, attached to every line of it. Menems had given me a guild seal, a registration number, and a system that would keep proving, one stamp at a time, that a title stripped away in one kingdom meant nothing at all in the next one over. I closed the ledger, and for the first time since the assassination, building something felt less like survival and more like the beginning of a plan. The plan, it turned out, needed paperwork. We'd crossed out of Menemes days earlier, chasing word of an academic city called Mitriale further north, and the guild that governed this stretch of road didn't care what papers I carried from a different kingdom. New territory, new forms. Colin complained about the tax dodge the entire walk to the counter, and then filled out both our applications anyway, because he was faster at forms than I was, and worse at admitting he liked being useful. Agnia's voice came muffled from the bag at my hip, already bored with the whole errand. You could just write mage and be done with it. Colin didn't look up from the form. They test whatever you write. Write puppet master. Nobody tests a puppet master. I didn't argue. He was right, and he knew he was right. And the small satisfaction he took in being right about paperwork was one of the more harmless things about him. The receptionist, an elf with the kind of composure her job required, took one look at my face and lost about 2 full seconds of it. She recovered only once she noticed Dios riding my brother's shoulder, small, black-winged, faintly ink-colored, and decided a stranger with a striking face and stranger company probably didn't need close examination on either count. It's just the doll. She gestured vaguely at Dios, flustered, like the word covered him. It's unusual. He gets that. Colin didn't elaborate. The hall around us was full of the kind of noise a guild hall is always full of. Adventurers arguing over quest boards, a fee dispute 2 counters down, someone's familiar knocking a stack of forms onto the floor, and nobody bothering to pick them up. Nobody looked twice at either of us for longer than the receptionist had. That, more than anything, was the point of coming this far north in the first place. My face bought silence in Clambia. Out here, it barely bought a second glance. Colin bared a fang when she asked his age. It answered every remaining question about vampire half registration faster than the form could have. Humans needed 13 years behind them. Half vampires needed nothing but proof, and proof, apparently, meant teeth. We should register with the Merchant Guild too, while we're here, Tiza said, muffled, from somewhere near my other hip. Save Dumatra the grief of sorting through your pockets again. She had a point. The Great Spirit who managed items for every spirit of special grade and above had started sending word through Sylph's old network that my particular collection of unclassifiable inventory was becoming a personal headache for her, and a formal merchant registration would at least give the mess an official shelf to sit on, instead of wherever it currently lived. I filed the thought away for after the adventurer paperwork cleared, 1 line at a time. 2 copper coins each, 2 applications, and a short walk toward the courtyard later. We were somebody's business again, under a new name, in a new country, same as always. Colin went first. His examiner was a white-furred alpaca beastman named Pakal, cheerful right up until Colin bit down on my forearm without asking, drank exactly as much as he needed, and told me it wouldn't cost me much because I was weak enough already. You're welcome, I said. He was already walking toward the ring. I didn't ask because you'd have said yes anyway. Pakal's trick was a length of white cloth that could dodge one kind of attack completely. magic or muscle, never both at once. And for the first exchange, it worked exactly the way it was meant to. He read Colin's shadow bolts, slid the cloth into their path, and stepped clear of a follow-up strike a half-second before it landed, grinning the whole time like the fight was still just for fun. Colin didn't grin back. He fed Dios another 2 shadow bats and watched, with the patience of someone who already knew how this ended, as the cloth started lagging half a beat behind where it needed to be. Then, Dios started eating the shadow bats Colin kept summoning, converting each one into speed, and Pakal's cloth couldn't decide fast enough which kind of attack was actually coming. Colin caught him in a tangle of rose-colored thorns grown straight out of his own forearm, and didn't let go until the alpaca tapped the dirt twice, breathing hard. Done. "How did you know my cloth couldn't block both?" Pakal asked, still catching his breath. "It's a secret." Colin wouldn't say another word about it, no matter how many times Pakal asked. He asked 4 more times before the match was even fully called, circling Colin at a wary distance, like the answer might fall out of him if he asked from a new enough angle. Colin let him keep guessing. I'd learned by now that letting people keep guessing was, for Colin, its own small pleasure, cheaper than actually winning, and it lasted longer. The senior examiner overseeing the match, brown-furred, older, calm in the specific way of someone who had graded a few thousand fights already, filed Colin straight into the middle ranks as an exception, and moved on without much ceremony, already calling for the next pairing. Colin celebrated by riding Dios in a slow, smug lap around the courtyard, ignoring everyone who tried to congratulate him. My own examiner introduced herself as Akaru and smiled the way people smile right before ending you efficiently. I sent Golfuna in first, my own golem, hammer-shaped and stubborn, a tool that had spent its whole existence forcing evolution onto other things, and clearly had opinions about being on the receiving end for once. Akaru's defensive wall cracked him on the first swing. He retreated, dented and sulking, and I told him he'd done well anyway, because he had. Aknea and Tiza had been drinking since breakfast and fought like it. Aknea threw a full wine bottle straight through 3 of Akaru's barriers, before Akaru, unbothered, redirected an entire wave of water back onto me instead, soaking me to the collar, while Aknea laughed loud enough to be heard over the wind. Tiza pulled a wall of earth out of the ground fast enough to save me from a barrier that had started chasing me across the courtyard with real, focused intent. She followed it with a rough sand construct that lasted exactly as long as it took Akaru to notice it existed, then finished it off with a single unbothered flick of her wrist. I got as far as reaching for the one skill that actually mattered, the one that would have converted whatever came next into an egg, and answered, without meaning to, a question I very much did not want answered in a guild courtyard. Before Akaru called the match, unhurried, like she'd known the whole time exactly how far she needed to let it run. Akaru looked me over once more, not unkindly, before she spoke. "You're cleared. There's a rumor going around about a doll user causing trouble down in Terra Takula. You matched the description closely enough that I had to check. I appreciate the thoroughness," I said. I did not ask what the description was. I already knew. Some things are better left as somebody else's unsolved case, filed away where it belonged. Akaru walked me through the rest without ceremony, a written portion on top of the practical, questions on basic arithmetic, guild etiquette, and one lone question about magic circles that I answered better than she expected, judging by the raised eyebrow. She marked me past, handed the papers back, and moved on to the next name on her list before I'd finished thanking her. We walked out registered, both of us, mine listed under Puppet Master, his listed as an exception nobody had bothered to fully explain to either of us. A wolf beastman caught us on the way out, tail low with the particular embarrassment of a man about to ask strangers for help. He gave his name as Gress. He had a temporary party and a quest to gather something called Icebook from the Reddletrine snowfield, and not enough hands left to finish before the weather turned on him. Colin said no before Gress finished the sentence. Already turning to go, he added, "Find someone else." I said yes before he'd fully turned. Gress's ears came up so fast they nearly caught me in the chin. "On one condition," I said. "I get to touch a wolf beastman's tail, once, and the ears." Gress looked mortified, glanced at Colin for backup that clearly wasn't coming, and agreed anyway, which told me he needed the help more than the mortification cost him. Fine, he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Touch whatever you want, but you're seeing this through to the end." All of it. You say that like it's a hardship for me. I didn't bother hiding the grin. You have no idea what you've just agreed to. I'm starting to get an idea. Colin gave me a look that suggested he was revising his opinion of my judgment downward permanently, but he fell into step beside me without further argument. Gress shook my hand like the deal might evaporate if he hesitated a second longer than necessary, and we went back inside to make the temporary party arrangement official before anyone changed their mind. The ice books came easy, gathered in under an hour from a low field where they grew in loose, papery clusters under the snow. The weather did not cooperate. A blizzard the local forecast had sworn wouldn't happen dropped visibility to nothing about an hour from camp, and that was when Gress admitted, through chattering teeth, that he'd caught a fever 2 days earlier, hadn't told anyone, and could no longer tell which direction was which. Colin hit him once, hard, with a fist wrapped in Dios's covering, and Gress went down into the snow without another sound. Useless, Colin said. We leave him. No, he'll slow us down. We're not leaving a companion in a blizzard because he got sick and didn't want to admit it. Colin looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that used to mean something colder before the oath, then shrugged, like the argument had never really mattered to him at all. He crouched, checked Grace's pulse with 2 fingers, and stood back up, satisfied he hadn't actually done any lasting harm. Tisa reported worse news through the wind. A bear big enough to shrug off most weapons headed our way, something small and floating that wasn't worth naming, and, further out, patient, unhurried, a Trozy, old and undead. The kind of thing with its own reputation among people who'd never seen one and hoped to keep it that way. Kill the first 2 if you must, she said. Leave the last one be. It won't come near walls. Colin went out alone into the storm to handle the smaller 2, gone long enough that I started counting the minutes against the cold, and came back cheerful, snow melting off him in sheets, already asking what was for dinner like he hadn't just walked into a blizzard to kill something bigger than he was. Whatever had happened out there, he wasn't inclined to describe it, and I didn't press. Tisa raised a wall of packed earth 20 meters high around a shelter of her own making, a whole small village conjured out of frozen ground in about the time it took me to drag Gress's dead weight through the door on my own. Tall enough, she said, that the Trozy would avoid the whole area on principle rather than test it. I believed her. I'd learned not to question the spirits who'd been doing this since long before I was born. Gress woke up furious, with a headache and no memory of how he'd gotten inside. Colin's chosen method of waking him, a shadow spell that yanked his whole body sideways for 1 ugly second, hadn't improved either of their moods. And I told Colin, sharper than I meant to, that there were kinder ways to wake a sick man. He didn't answer. He just left the room, Dios trailing after him like a small dark flag, and didn't come back. I found him sitting alone against the far wall, Dios wrapped tight around his shoulders for warmth he didn't actually need against the cold. Is he more important than me? He asked, not looking up. No, I said. He's a stranger I wasn't willing to let die out there. You're my brother. He didn't answer for a while. Then he put his arms around me, hard enough to hurt, and admitted, furious with himself for admitting it out loud, that he wanted to be the thing I chose first, every single time, without ever having to ask. You already are, I told him, and meant it. He wiped his face with the back of one hand, annoyed at himself for the tears more than for anything I'd said, and let Dios settle back down around his shoulders like the argument had never happened. I didn't push him to say anything more. He'd already said more than he usually let himself. We apologized to Gress over smoked ham and firelight, all 3 of us pretending the night hadn't gone quite the way it had. Gress, for his part, apologized right back for eating half our food without asking, which struck me as a strange thing to apologize for after being knocked unconscious in a snowbank, and he laughed when I told him so. You 2 are strange. Gress pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, watching us over the fire. Fight like that, then turn around and go through all this trouble over me. I've traveled with worse people who liked me a lot more. He's not usually this bad. I nudged Colin's boot with mine. I'm sitting right here. Colin didn't even open his eyes. Colin fell asleep before the plates were cleared, worn out from a fight he'd been having with himself long before I'd ever known he existed. 2 days later, the ice books delivered and a reward collected heavy enough to fund the next leg of the trip without touching the ledger. Gress shook my hand, thanked us more than the job strictly required, and went his own way. Colin and I turned back toward the tower that actually mattered. Colin found the right tower before I did. One glance at a building he'd never seen, and a use of the gift he never talked about, and led us straight to a wolf beast woman named Amona, who took our forms without blinking at either of our faces. I had practiced the presentation once, the night before, alone, out loud, to an empty room. Once was enough. I laid it out for her the way you lay out a case you already know is airtight. 4 tiers of inventory across 9 magical categories. 18 months of production, recorded in a ledger I'd started keeping the day I understood what the eggs were actually worth. 3 buyer relationships with trading houses large enough to carry their own seals. The guild consignment records from the Menem's Mass Hatch run, stamped, dated, and impossible to argue with. I set each piece down in the order that built the strongest case, not the order I'd collected them in, and paused after each one long enough to let it register before moving to the next. Amona read through all of it without changing expression, made a note in the margin, and carried the file into a back chamber where 5 senior evaluators sat behind a long table with the specific flat attention of people who had genuinely seen everything a merchant could bring them. I waited. Colin sat at the side of the room, quiet, present in the low-key way he'd started being present for things that weren't his own fights to win. Tiza and Aknea kept still enough that neither evaluator so much as glanced their way, which was, for the 2 of them, its own kind of restraint. The 5 of them worked through the catalog in order, methodical, unhurried, the way people examine something they expect to find flaws in and keep not finding any. One checked the ledger's dates against the buyer letters. Another weighed a sample from the 4th tier on a small brass scale that hummed faintly when it settled. Nobody spoke much. The green light from the statue outside moved slowly across the floor as the morning went on, and I let the silence sit rather than fill it, because filling it was exactly what a man with something to hide would do. One of the evaluators lifted a single item out of the catalog and set it apart from the rest. A jar of honey the color of old amber, dense with a light that didn't come from the window. She read the documentation once. She read it a second time, slower, her thumb tracing back over one line, like she wanted to be certain she hadn't misread it the first time. She passed it, without a word, to the examiner beside her, who turned the jar once in the light and made a small sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "Where was this acquired?" he asked. "A gift," I said, "from a spirit queen who misunderstood the nature of the transaction." They discussed it in voices too low to follow, checking the item's mana signature against itself twice, the way a person checks something they already believe and still can't quite let themselves believe. A 3rd evaluator joined them, then a 4th, until all 5 stood clustered around one small jar of honey instead of the wide table of documents they'd spent the last hour on. It was real. It matched every claim the paperwork made for it, and then some. And none of them said so out loud, but the room's whole temperature changed anyway. I held the joke privately, because some jokes only work if you keep them to yourself. A queen named Alara had sent divine bees to kill a dead prince 3 years into his 2nd life. Instead of killing him, they had produced the single rarest item in his entire catalog, the one thing currently deciding, in a quiet room in a city she would never set foot in, whether that same prince qualified for the guild's highest civilian rank. I considered, for exactly one moment, whether the universe had a sense of humor. I decided it probably did, and left it right there, unspoken, mine alone to keep. The lead examiner set the honey extracts documentation down in the center of the table and gave his finding without ceremony. Catalog scope, production volume, and artifact tier all cleared the threshold. Jewel rank. The words landed in the room the way a verdict lands in a courtroom that already suspected the outcome, quietly and then all at once. Colin didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I caught the look on his face out of the corner of my eye, the particular stillness he wore when something actually mattered to him. And then it was gone again, tucked back behind the low-key composure he'd worn all morning, because this wasn't his fight to celebrate out loud. It was enough that he'd seen it happen. The seal came down. Amona opened a record book bound in something that looked older than the tower it sat in, and wrote the name into the guild's permanent record in careful, deliberate script. Alfed, merchant, jewel rank, first recognized in Menemessa, youngest recipient in the guild's 400-year living history. What it meant was the highest rank the guild granted below the handful of houses that had held their names for 3 generations and never once had to explain them. What it proved was that a man with no family willing to claim him, no title anyone still honored, and a witnessed death record 3 years old could build all of this. The ledger, the catalog, the honey a goddess-adjacent assassination attempt had accidentally handed him. The shelves of inventory sitting untouched in a shop that wasn't even open yet, out of nothing but a border crossing and a single egg. What it would eventually mean for a kingdom that had buried him under a different name I did not say out loud in that room, and did not need to, because the record now existed whether I said it or not, permanent and dated and impossible to unmake, leading straight back to the 13th prince they had sworn could never amount to anything, and I carried it out of the room with me. The final step needed blood instead of ink. A shallow prick against the card's surface, absorbed instantly, the guild's oldest and least explainable piece of magic. I registered under Alphad, same as everything else built since the crossing, and understood exactly what that cost. The empire now belonged on paper to a man who didn't legally exist. Every future contract, every future record, every future customer would know a name that had never once been spoken over a royal cradle. Correcting that someday meant unwinding every one of those records back to a truth I hadn't decided how to reveal yet. It was a problem I intended to solve eventually, on my own terms, once the ground underneath it was solid enough to survive the correction. Amona offered a parting gift I hadn't asked for, a small crystal payment device polished bright enough to catch the green light from the statue outside, and told me, with a perfectly straight face, that the guild's annual fee ran 50 gold coins, and the tax on everything I sold came to 3 of every 100, due at the start of the next year. I paid the day's registration fee, 10 gold coins, without arguing about any of it. By the time we reached the street, the guild staff had already lined up to bless the newest jewel rank merchant in their own ceremonial way, murmuring the same line together as I passed, a blessing from a luck god I'd never worshipped, and clearly didn't need. A crowd that had been listening at the windows got loud fast, the way crowds do when they smell money about to move somewhere new. Colin took the opening before I could stop him. After lunch, he called out to the whole plaza, "There's a shop opening. Come find it." He'd already named it, Alcohol. He wouldn't explain where the name came from, no matter how I asked, and I decided I didn't need him to. Some things a brother gets to keep for himself. The space had been ready for weeks. Inventory sorted by category, shelved and labeled. Potions along the near wall, raw magic stone in a locked case by the counter. The divine class honey extracts remaining stock kept apart from everything else, same as it had been in the evaluation room. The ledger sat open on the counter, blank page waiting. Sylph settled near the door, quiet, present without needing to be asked. Tiza took one look at the shelving and started rearranging it without asking. Agnia found the back room's stock of wine within about a minute of walking in and declared the whole operation acceptable. The first customer of the first official day was an alchemist, midway through a project she'd been stuck on for half a year. "You actually have this?" she asked, turning the jar over twice in her hands, like it might disappear if she blinked. "I do. I've been to 11 shops looking. Then I'm glad I'm the 12th. She paid full price without trying to talk me down, thanked me, and left without looking back. I wrote the sale into the ledger the same careful way I'd have written any other day's first entry, because that was exactly what it was. The opening line of what I intended to be several thousand more. A second customer came before the first was fully out the door. Then a third, word of the morning's blessing, and Colin's shouted announcement clearly having done exactly what he'd intended it to do. None of them haggled hard. All of them left with something in hand. By the time the light through the front window had shifted from midday to afternoon, the ledger's first page was already half full, and I had at once had to stop and remind myself this was real. This was the shop a boy nobody had expected anything from had built for himself, out of a skill the entire royal court had laughed at once, starting from a cliff where somebody had tried to make sure he never got up again. The sign went up properly the next morning before the street had a single customer on it. Just alcohol, painted plain, catching the first gray light instead of the guild statue's green. Sylph stood near the door, not on watch, just there, the same way he'd been there since a cliff I hadn't let myself think about in longer than I should admit. The kingdom had a tomb with my birth name carved into it. The guild now had a record with a different one. Both were true. Both were permanent. Somewhere between those two facts sat every person who still wanted me gone. And eventually, one of them was going to notice the gap and start asking questions I wasn't ready to answer in public. I had been turning that gap over since the night I crossed the border alone with nothing but an egg and a new name, and I kept reaching the same answer every time I let myself think it all the way through. It didn't matter what they did when they finally found out. By the time they did, I would already have built enough that nothing they tried could undo it. I thought about the ledger Colin still couldn't keep as neatly as I could, no matter how many times he insisted otherwise. I thought about the oath he'd sworn to a great spirit in a room with the ice still melting off him, and the fact that he hadn't broken it once since. Not even when breaking it would have been easier. I thought about a jar of honey that had started its life as an assassination attempt and ended it funding the highest rank a merchant could hold. They will find out, I thought, standing in the gray light with the door still locked behind me. I have been ready since the crossing. The only question left is whether they'll be ready for what they find. Somewhere south of here, a court that had never once said my name in public still believed the story it had buried. A queen was still maneuvering. A first prince's power base was still quietly cracking apart under him. A king who had signed an order he wept over afterward still didn't know how badly it had failed. None of them knew the shape of what was standing in this doorway, and I intended to keep it that way for exactly as long as it served me, and not one day longer. The sign said alcohol. The ledger was open. There was inventory on the shelves, a spirit standing quietly by the door, and a brother somewhere behind me who'd sworn an oath he hadn't broken yet. I was ready.